Go ahead, Carmen.
Good morning, everyone. We would like to welcome you to the Allen Temple Baptist Church's Health Education Ministries 2022 virtual health fair. Today's theme is racism, a public health crisis. And we are going to start by me introducing my fabulous co-facilitator for today, and that is Dr. Kathy Littles. She is currently the provost at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Previously, Provost Littles served as Dean of the School of Consciousness and Transformation and Director of the Transformative Inquiry Department at CIIS. From 2019 to 2021, she served at St. Mary's College as the Vice President of Faculty Development, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and her tenure of experience also includes faculty positions at the University of California at Davis, Berkeley City College, and the College of Marin. She earned a PhD in Cultural Studies with designated emphases in feminist theory and research from the University of California at Davis, and an MA in Anthropology from San Francisco State University. Good morning and welcome, please, Dr. Kathy Littles.
Good morning, Sister Carla, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Our invocation this morning will be offered by Brother Bruce Hardy. I want to tell you a little bit about Brother Hardy. He is a registered cardiac invasive specialist, forgive me this morning, at Alta Bates Medical Center in Oakland, California. He graduated from Lamone College with a degree in business administration. Bruce joined the Navy as a hospital corpsman, where he was the recipient of the Navy Achievement Medal of Honor. He currently is a board member at Allen Temple Baptist Church, and he serves on the Health and Social Service African American Project. He is married and currently resides in San Leandro, California. Welcome, Brother Hardy. Oops, Brother Hardy, you're muted. That's okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Can we bow our heads? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for everyone on this webinar. Father, you know what we are setting out to do to accomplish today. We ask you for your guidance, your wisdom, and support as we begin this health fair. Father, we ask you to help us to engage in meaningful decisions, allow us to grow closer as a group, find ways to better serve our community. We thank you for our pastor, the Allen Temple family, the Health Education Services, and all the presenters today. This we ask in your name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Hardy. It is my honor to welcome our Reverend Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson, Senior Pastor at the Allen Temple Baptist Church, who will be providing our welcome and opening remarks. Hi, everyone. I understand that we're having a little trouble with audio and we're working to correct it right now. Thank you.
Devastating effects of racism on
Good morning, Allen Temple friends and family, and all of you who are joining us live this morning for our 2022 virtual health fair. We are so glad that you are joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson, Senior Pastor of the Allen Temple Baptist Church, and it is my pleasure, my absolute pleasure, to welcome you, and not only welcome you, but to express my deep thanks and gratitude to our health education ministry, to our leaders. We thank God for Deacon Goodman and for his entire team for pulling this together. Because the truth of the matter is if the pandemic has not done anything, it certainly revealed to us the devastating effects of racism on our health. And so the title of this health fair, the focus of this health fair is so appropriate. All we heard throughout the past 2 years is the disproportionate impact that COVID was having, particularly on African-American communities and other communities of color. Because framing racism as a public health crisis is a clarion call, not only to our governments and to public health organizations, but to all of us to understand and to develop a systemic, broad-based response in the same way we have to address so many of the health issues that affect our bodies, whether it's legislation, whether it's education, whether it's support services, or whether it's finances. We have to recognize that racism is in fact deadly. It is in fact deadly, whether it's lack of access to health care, whether it's our socioeconomic status. All of these are contributing factors to the health conditions that we struggle with, from diabetes to cancer to maternal death to stress, and yes, even to COVID-19. And so I'm so excited that our amazing guests are joining us today to engage in this much needed conversation, bringing all of their experience, bringing all of their expertise. And so won't you share this now? Won't you contact someone, share this, email this link out to your sphere of influence later? Because we are living in a city. We are in the city of Oakland, where our church is located. And in June of this year, Oakland joined a number of cities and counties across the country in declaring racism as a public health crisis. And in doing so, they also set money aside in their budget to begin the analysis, the data analysis, and looking at what systemic changes need to happen in order to close the gap that exists within our community. But we recognize that this is just a first step. And one of the ways that we can exercise our influence on our leaders is making sure we become educated about what this means. Too many of us died during the last 2 years simply because there was a disproportionate effect, lack of access, and follow through in our community. People wanted to know, why did you test on your parking lot? Why did you vaccinate? Because there were people for whom, if it was not located near them, never would have made it to a Kaiser, never would have made it to a John Muir, never would have made it to some of the other health funds in our area. And so we have to remember, Scripture speaks to us about not only our personal health and our bodies being temples, but it speaks to public health. It speaks to God's desire for us to be in good health and have ourselves and our health prosper even as our souls prosper. And it speaks to us about our responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for the communities and the cities that we live in, to make sure that the healing of God, whether it comes through medicine, whether it comes through doctors and hospitals, or whether it comes through that supernatural healing that so many people end up believing God for because they don't have access to adequate health care. It becomes our responsibility to increase awareness and to make sure that we are educating. So I thank you once again for joining us. This is going to be a wonderful, amazing, stimulating conversation. And I certainly pray that God will continue to bless us and keep us, but moreover, to equip us in ways that we really can become a part of the solution in addressing the deep systemic changes that need to happen. We are so very grateful. We've been blessed to have partnerships with our area health institutions, but we also recognize there's much more that can be done. And so God's blessings to each and every one of you. Once again, share this information. Welcome to all of our guests, and thank you so much for joining us. We are believing God for an incredible virtual health fair. Blessings to you.
Thank you, Pastor Jackie. We will indeed share this valuable information, and thank you for that powerful, powerful introduction. Before I introduce our first guest, I want to share with you that the Allen Baptist Church Health Education Ministry would like to acknowledge our long-term partnership with 50 Hoops, who have been a major supporters of educating minorities about different types of cancers, clinical trials, and the impact of COVID in our communities. Thank you to Ed and Pat Sanders, the leaders of 50 Hoops, and the recognition of Deacon Harold Goodman. Thank you, Deacon Harold, as a 50 Hoops legend who has continued to promote the 50 Hoops values. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our first guest, Aziza Todd, who will be talking to us this morning about framing racism through a public health lens. A little bit about Aziza Todd. Aziza was born and raised in Oakland. She attended the University of California, Los Angeles, and graduated with a BA in Gender Studies with departmental honors. Todd has developed and facilitated mandated anti-racism Blackness workshops at UCLA, organized cross-campus conferences, and spoken across the state. After graduating, she decided to jump back into academia and pursue a Master of Public Health at San Francisco State. Upon completion of her degree in May 2022, she was awarded the College of Health and Social Sciences graduatehood. Congratulations on that. She will be teaching for San Francisco State's Department of Public Health in the fall and hopes to earn her doctorate of public health or doctorate of education in the near future to continue teaching what she's learned with college level students. Aziza, it's lovely to see you this morning, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you all for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And go into presentation mode. Awesome. So I want to first thank the organizers of the workshop, specifically Carla and the members of the Health Education Ministry for giving me, a new MPH graduate, the opportunity to speak on such an important matter. And I also want to thank my mom, who's in the other room, and the members of my immediate chosen and church family who are able to join in this morning. So once again, my name is Azisa. I'll be teaching at SF State in the fall. And the title of my keynote today, we say keynote speech, but it's more of a presentation, but I'll be talking about framing racism through a public health lens. So just a brief kind of overview. I want to start with opening a land acknowledgement to honor the original stewards of the land both I and Allen Temple currently reside on. Then in aligning with my educational praxis, I believe it's important to provide terminologies and definitions before having fuller discussions. So I'll be providing a concrete definition of racism using a public health lens from public health officials. Then I'm going to outline the ecological model as a framework for broadening our understanding of racism to acknowledge it goes beyond individual interactions and it's interconnected into systems such as our health system. And then lastly, in defining the ecological model, I want to provide some examples of how racism is engaged at each level so we can understand the racist practices that are implemented into our policies and embedded in everyday society. But throughout this event, I hope everybody here is able to reflect on where the ecological model and public health overall shows up and engage in critical thinking surrounding the topics that are covered today. So first, just starting with a land acknowledgement. We in this virtual space acknowledge that we reside on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. We recognize them as original stewards of this land and understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples for their enduring commitment to Mother Earth and dedication to the reclaiming of the land and its history as a result of westernization and colonization. And I encourage folks that aren't currently residing on Ohlone people's land to learn about the land, the original land stewards of the places that they currently reside on. So when tasked with developing this presentation, I spent time thinking about what would be necessary to cover before diving into public health. And as an educator, I believe it's critical to provide context and language to help structure our thoughts. In tackling a larger issue like racism as it coincides with public health, I figured why not draw up the American Public Health Association's definition, through which Dr. Jones defines racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly disadvantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. This definition is grounding, though it could definitely be improved. But there are a few statements within this definition I want to highlight. One, that racism saps the strength of society, and two, it heightens the waste of human resources. Navigating and facing racism is not only draining on an individual level, but exhaustive to society. And when we continuously produce laws and policies and engage with racist interactions, we constantly find ourselves in an upward fight for resources that are not equitably available. So in defining racism, I hope to kind of think about how public health plays a role, not only in working to combat racism, but also acknowledging the historical implications that public health has had on racism. So one of the first frameworks I engaged with when getting my master's degree was the ecological model. And there are many different frameworks that build off of the ecological model, but this is one of the first grounding ones. And Rimmer and Glanz define it as a model that emphasizes the interactions between and interdependence of factors within and across all levels of a health problem. So I did a little bit of searching to figure out where the interconnectedness of the ecological model and racism coincide. And there are very few publications that were able to provide me with a more grounding structure, but I'm very thankful to have found one from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So we'll be using this particular image, the circles that you see here, to help us kind of get a more grounding understanding. But in a nutshell, an ecological approach focuses on both population and individual level factors that contribute to health outcomes and health behaviors of various populations. And I appreciate the definition of racism on the left because it incorporates aspects of history, specifically white supremacy, as an ideology that impacts individual and systemic impacts on health, wellness, and quality of life for marginalized populations. The ecological model reminds us that implications of health exist beyond the individual level in the same way that racism goes beyond individual or one-off acts of discrimination. In order to address racism as a public health issue, we have to address every facet that it impacts. The ecological model consists of 4 interdependent factors, and I'll explain each one within the context of the current field I work in, mental health. And so for some context, I provide capacity building trainings and education to mental health clinicians around San Mateo County to help them in incorporating better practices when working with marginalized communities and understanding their mental health needs. So as mentioned, you'll be seeing this circular image come up quite often as we build upon the layers of how racism plays a role in public health and why it's a crisis. So first, starting with the individual or interpersonal level, this first factor refers to learned behaviors, beliefs, skills, and knowledge that we acquire based on the social norms we grow up in. So it can be our cultural backgrounds. And in tying this to public health, it can look like internalized privilege and/or oppression. And internalized racism manifested through stigmatization of seeking help shows up quite often in my field of mental health. I'd be quite surprised how often I get questions from mental health practitioners asking, well, I go to, I try to reach out to my clients, but they just don't really want to talk about mental health. They're unsure how to navigate that. So in taking this for an example, and unfortunately common trope that we see in the Black community is we don't have depression, or we don't have mental health issues, or we didn't grow up having all that. And I hear that quite often in some of my elders in my community. And specifically for Black women, there's the trope of the superhero or the superwoman that heavily impacts the way how we fail to navigate mental health issues. And we normalize a cultural belief that we just simply don't experience mental health issues to the same extent as other communities. And this internalized stigma is part of a racist system that can contribute to us not seeking the mental health services we truly need. But despite this cultural belief, the Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health reports that Black adults are more likely than whites to report feelings of distress. Yet only 1 in 3 Black adults with mental health conditions seek treatment. So we internalize a lot of that stigma and racism, and it comes from a top-down approach. But when we internalize that, we feel that we don't need to seek out the services that we know we need to receive. So going a little bit step further, thinking about the interpersonal or relational, this is the next factor. And these relationships include the ones that we have with blood family, extended or chosen family, colleagues, coworkers, and social networks we build. And once again, in using the example of mental health, internalized misconceptions of African Americans not experiencing mental health conditions to the same extent of their white counterparts impacts interpersonal level health. They show up as microaggressions and implicit bias within provider networks. And according to Mental Health America, African Americans are less diagnosed with mood disorders compared to white counterparts, yet more likely to be misdiagnosed with schizophrenia and more quote unquote extreme mental health disorders. Internalized stigma at the intrapersonal level, layered with microaggressions and biases from health providers at an interpersonal level, now make it even more difficult for Black Americans to seek adequate mental health services. And all of this is rooted in racism. So once again, we see that building up and that layering of the cultural belief that we just don't need these services, to then providers saying, well, if they're saying we don't need these, they don't need these services, then why should we allocate these services? Or if we do, providers are seeing Black communities come in asking for services, they might be heightening misdiagnosis of schizophrenia rather than addressing more common mood disorders such as depression and anxiety. And these are all rooted in biases around racism. And before I continue, of course, if folks have any questions, I encourage folks to put them in the Q&A box, or y'all can save questions till afterwards. So now, once again, taking it a step further and looking a bit broader, we look to the institutional or community. And at the community level, this includes the formal and informal relationships we have with institutions like the built environment, neighborhood associations, et cetera. And in conjunction with communities, institution refers to the formal and informal social institutions. So once again, looking within the context of racism, this can look like policies and laws existing within those formal institutions that influence and heighten racial inequalities and inequities. In the context of mental health, this can look like policies that allocate more funds for police officers to respond to mental health crises calls, of which majority of the officers are ill-equipped to handle such interactions. The Washington Post maintains a database of fatal police shootings from about 2014 to present. And in my graduate thesis, which was an extension of my undergraduate thesis that looked at fatal police interactions between Black mentally disabled populations and police officers. In California alone, a little over 160 Black individuals were fatally killed by police officers, with 29 of those individuals being mentally disabled. And despite these numbers, policies and laws are continuously created to fund historically racist institutions like officers who disproportionately impact the life outcomes of Black and Brown individuals who have a strained relationship with the formal institution. So oftentimes police officers are not trained adequately enough to deal with calls of mental health crisis and de-escalation tactics, which results in more fatal interactions and the loss of life, specifically of Black mentally disabled community members. And in this work, I encourage folks to look at the Washington Post database and the fatal police interactions, just to look at the numbers and see how often these instances come up. Of course, not all the information can be documented. And then lastly, we look at the systemic and societal level. The most broadest category within the broader category within the ecological model that seeps into all of the previous levels that we discussed. And this looks like norms, history, and ideologies that reinforce racism and its implications towards BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. Once again, in my graduate thesis about Black mentally disabled communities and police interactions, I referenced a paper by a fellow public health colleague, Dr. Supriya Misra, where she examines the historical context that alludes to present day apprehension and mistrust of mental health services by African-American communities. And this paper, Dr. Misra quotes, "During slavery, Black people were thought to have lower rates of mental illness. However, after emancipation, Black people were identified as having higher rates of psychotic disorders because of racist beliefs about the loss of behavioral control. The diagnoses became further racialized during the civil rights movement when prisons started classifying Black people, especially men, protesting in the movement as psychotic to justify transferring them into inpatient hospitals. African communities specifically, their lack of representation, allocation of resources, and overall support regarding mental health is not an anomaly, but rather exists within a larger social context and historic trauma dating back to slavery. We simply cannot continue as advocates of public health to ignore the history and systemic level impacts of racism on BIPOC populations. So what does this mean within the context of racism as a public health issue? This means that in order to address and combat racism, we cannot work to address individual and interpersonal implications of racism, but rather work towards dismantling it at all levels. And once again, throughout the presentations today, I encourage everyone to see how racism exists within all facets of not only the ecological model, but also placing yourselves within the context of the topics presented today. And I hope that folks are able to take away that this is a collective effort. We cannot do this alone. Not only myself as a public health advocate, but also thinking about communities and how we can garner support. And I'll talk a bit more about some food for thought and strategies in the closing. But once again, thank you all for being here. And I look forward to hearing more about the presentations today. I'm gonna stop share.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I want to open it up to our audience, and if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we're happy to ask Aziza for her expertise in this area. I have a question. I thought your image and chart was fascinating, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about internalized racism and how we as a community traditionally don't seek help, and what that means, how to address this as a community, both as individuals and as a group. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, within the context of mental health and internalized racism, it's difficult for us to seek out services, right? It's difficult for us to be vulnerable and ask for help. And unfortunately, we think about a larger level, right? We exist in a society where we focus on individualism, right? We focus on, we shouldn't be seeking out services. We should just figure out on our own. And so when we've, grown up in a society where that's the context in which, we just seek out on our own, we don't ask for help, that creates and perpetuates a very vicious cycle of just that internalized stigma of, I can figure it out, I can solve it on my own. And so we see those larger tropes, as I mentioned, like the Black woman being the superhero. And that plays a very dangerous role on not just mental health, but also overall health outcomes. And so to that context, I encourage us to just have more difficult conversations around what seeking help means. It also means providing community resources. So if there's anybody within our networks that we know works in that particular field where you need support, it's okay to reach out. It's difficult to be vulnerable in these situations. And that's why I love the field of mental health, because there are providers and resources that are working to do that outreach when we know there are particular communities that struggle with that. So if there are, community members in this space that do need to seek out resources and are unsure where to start, I'm not sure if folks will be sending out my email, but the organization that I work for does provide an abundance of resources to provide that grounding start, because sometimes what we just need is a little bit of a nudge. And that can be in resources, pamphlets, or just asking that initial question to get our foot in the door.
No, that's a wonderful answer. And if you don't mind typing in the chat the connection to your resource, that would be really wonderful.
Yes, I'll share that resource.
Okay. We have a couple of more questions. Can you talk a little bit about conversion disorder and how racism plays a role with people of color?
Oh, well, within my particular realm, I do a lot of training specifically for mental health providers. So I don't do, clinical work. And this is actually the first time I've heard the term conversion disorder. So I personally can't answer that question, but I actually would love to maybe follow up if possible, and do a little bit of digging to figure out, or to learn more about conversion disorder, and then maybe follow up afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next question is, what are some of the ways that we can dismantle racism? And do we start with our own communities?
First, I want to say hi, Auntie Kim. that's my auntie that's in there. And I know that she was a big advocate in this presentation. So yes, I do think to an extent it starts with communities, right? We can do a lot of community level approaches. For example, in my undergraduate thesis, I solely talked about, fatal interactions between police. But in my graduate thesis, I focused on community level organizations that are working to close that gap. So for example, there's organizations like the Anti-Police Terror Project, which is very big in Oakland, Sacramento, and they have a mental health crisis support team, which I was able to actually learn about their work and hopefully volunteer. But there are community level organizations that acknowledge that there are these issues happening and we have to provide community support. But then also those organizations work at a policy level. So they're working on, creating policies or, calling out politicians that are, funding racist institutions to hold them accountable. So yes, it does start at a community level, but we also acknowledge that a lot of these community organizing, it doesn't stop in this isolated bubble. It can expand towards, political and systemic branches. So yes, there's an interconnectedness there.
Yes, excellent. Well, we're up against time, but I do want to ask you one final question because I want you to put in a plug for more clinicians of color. The question is, do you think more Black people would seek help with mental health issues if there were more clinicians of color? And I know your answer, but I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. This just reminds me of back at UCLA, I did a program, and one of our research was about the lack of representation in what we called CAPS, or counseling and psychological services, and a lack of representation. So it's absolutely key to find people that look like us, that know and share similar experiences, to get the right resources. And there are actually abundance of resources that are available. I was able to find my therapist on therapyforblackgirls.com, and I know that there are an abundance of websites for us to seek out, clinicians that look like us, share similar experiences, and navigate society in similar ways. So yes, it is absolutely important that representation matters.
Excellent. Actually, I'm going to push time a little bit more because I want to get these final two questions in. First one is, the Black / minority communities often don't look at the medical fields as being favorable to our circumstances. How do we overcome this?
That's an interesting question. I think it can, within the context of like education, for example, right, it can start with just the lack of funding towards education to support, youth, Black youth, or minority communities in, engaging in the necessary courses and education to go within the medical field. I personally can share from my own experiences going to UCLA. I was ill-equipped, and I wanted to come in as, physiology, pre-med, wanted to become a doctor, go down that whole route. But I found that not only was I ill-equipped with the resources, I often found that the courses I was taking and the professors that I was engaging with did not care about the well-being and educational advancement of what I wanted to do. So to an extent, there are some individual level factors at play, but also think about the larger context of making sure we have an education system that supports the dreams of Black and minority communities that want to go into the medical field, but just don't have the resources and or educators to take them there. So once again, think about this context. It's not just individual, but it's also looking at to larger factors at stake. And so holding all those levels accountable. Great.
And you have a comment about your presentation, which has been great presentation. And the question is there any analysis on the impact that racism, as explained in this model, has on education, advocacy, affirmation of diverse cultures?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any particular resources. I would have to go back and potentially reach out to some colleagues that do work in education. I know one particular colleague I have, her name is Ruby. She teaches a course at SF State on education and curriculum, and she does briefly talk about the implications of racism in education. Mm-hmm. So I would defer back to her expertise as she's more involved and deeply embedded in the education system. But I do believe that there are probably an abundance of resources that do talk about and touch on that impact. Once again, just thinking back to the previous question of representation, that can be very huge, and the implications of racism, specifically on Black and Brown students, and not seeing educators that look like them and represent them in those backgrounds.
Yeah. Well, let's give a plug for your research. Talk a little bit about where you see your research going in the next, 2 to 5 years. What does the platform and landscape look like in this work for you?
Well, for me right now, I'm really working on capacity building and trainings and education. That's my favorite thing. So I enjoy that I get to do this with adults, right? And getting to navigate what their needs are. But then also I get to teach students in the fall, and I get to hear multiple perspectives. And so that really gets me excited. And of course, my particular field is within mental health, but the course that I am teaching is on structural oppression and social foundations of health. So similar things that I talked about here, right? Acknowledging that it's not just individual one-off interactions, but structures in societies as a whole that is rooted and embedded in oppression, and how that can impact, particularly my students. I'm centering them in my course, where they see their experiences and how oppression shows up, but also not dwelling on the negative implications there, and looking into how they can reimagine a society that supports them and affirms them, and ways to combat oppression. So very excited to be within the teaching realm, not just with adults, but with students, and I hope to continue doing that work.
That's fabulous. And as a provost, I'm just so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. We need more faculty like you. Have an excellent semester, and thank you for the work that you're doing in our community and for educating future scholars that will go out and do great work. So thank you.
Thank you so
Excellent
much.
Job. Okay, well, thank you. We are going to move to our next presentation by Dr. Charles Winden. Our next presentation is going to be on Not All Dementia is Alzheimer's, Differences Between These Conditions and Therapy Implications. I'd like to welcome Dr. Winden and tell you a little bit about his background. Dr. Winden is an MD, is an assistant professor of neurology at the University of California, San Francisco Memory and Aging Center. In his current role, he participates in the clinical care and management of those who present to the center with memory decline and cognitive changes. Dr. Winden is also passionate for service to underserved community and has been leading outreach efforts with multiple communities in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. Winden seeks to further understand diseases like Alzheimer's among all populations, with an emphasis on understanding the significance of certain special blood tests and blood imaging tests in those with concerns about their cognition. In addition, he seeks to understand the impact of social determinants of health, where we live, where we play, where we work, on cognition. Through his work and in these various efforts, Dr. Winden's ultimate career goal is is the elimination of disparities in neurodegenerative diseases and dementia. Dr. Winden receives his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University before obtaining his medical degree from Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in New Jersey. He completed his residency training in neurology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and his behavioral neurology fellowship at the University of California, San Francisco Memory and Aging Center. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Winden. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and tremendous thanks to the health ministry for just offering me the opportunity to be able to speak today. I'm really excited to be here. So I want to tackle the topic of dementia and Alzheimer's, and really getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty about how these conditions are different and why it's important that we understand this. So given kind of the time constraints, I really racked in my mind, how would we go about doing this? How are we going to break this down in a reasonable fashion such that we can walk away with some understanding about kind of what we're talking about? So I want to actually start with an example. I want to start with something completely unrelated. So I want you to imagine a train. I want you to imagine a train full of passengers. There's a conductor. The train gets started essentially from where, you know, it leaves station-wise and is ultimately headed to a destination, okay? Unfortunately, we know that there are some instances where a train can become, quote unquote, a runaway train. There can be things that happen with different parts of the braking system. There can be other things that happen maybe with the train engine, et cetera, such that the train is no longer necessarily under control of the conductor. The train is kind of running away. It's becoming less and less safe for those on board, okay? In this scenario, there are two outcomes for the runaway train typically, right? The runaway train can actually either be stabilized and ultimately reach a destination that is desirable in a safe manner. But the other alternative is that the runaway train isn't stabilized and the runaway train actually derails and there's damage and other things that happen. The causes for the runaway train to begin with are many, right? We mentioned a little bit about it could be an issue with the braking system. The braking systems for trains are very complex, just like the braking system for a car. And so there could be a multitude of different reasons why the runaway train even starts. And then there are a number of different strategies to either get the runaway train to be stabilized or different strategies that may not work that ultimately lead to the runaway train kind of falling off the tracks. So what does this have to do with brain health? What does this have to do with Alzheimer's and dementia? Well, I would argue that over the course of our lifetime, you can think of the train kind of under the control of the conductor, going along the track the way it's supposed to, as our healthy brain function. So everything's under control, things are working essentially the way they're supposed to. Sometimes, unfortunately, something can happen within the brain such that our brain function begins changing. So I have here the brain function begins changing due to X, and X can be many, many different things, right? It can be we have a change in brain function because of we've had a stroke. It can be we have a change in brain function because we've had a really bad head injury. All of these different things can contribute to this change in brain function. Using the train example again, I would argue that there is an opportunity to stabilize the brain function, even though it may be changing, but there is also the risk of not stabilizing the brain function and the brain function continuing to deteriorate. Okay, so let's use some actual specific terms. Let's bring in some specific terms here, specifically the term dementia. So normal cognition. Cognition is just a fancy term for kind of thinking and memory and brain ability skills. Normal cognition we'll think of as kind of the train under control, the train doing what it's supposed to be doing, our brain under control, our brain doing what's supposed to be doing. Mild cognitive impairment is actually this state where our brain function has changed a little bit. It's maybe not the same as it was before. There are things going on such that it's not operating quite the way it should be. So it may be operating more slowly. We may be having some memory problems. We may have trouble organizing things, figuring out how to use our phone. All of these things suggest that the brain's not quite functioning optimally, but the brain is still functioning, right? The train is still on the track, so we're still headed in a direction. We have the opportunity, again, to stabilize kind of this brain function so that, hey, there may still be some things that are kind of a bit off. They're not quite the way they were when we were 20, 25 years old, but my brain is still functioning, still doing well to the point where I can live independently. Or we could sometimes, unfortunately, end up in the stage of dementia, which is, you can think of the brain function is not stabilized, it continues to worsen, and ultimately the brain function becomes poor enough where we can't actually live independently any longer, okay? So thinking about this example and trying to break down these different, concepts and these different words with all these different meanings, this is kind of a way to think about normal brain function versus maybe not so normal brain function, but still hanging in there, which is mild cognitive impairment, versus dementia, which is brain function that's really not so good, such that we can't take care of ourselves independently any longer. So what is dementia specifically? Okay, a couple of facts. So as we age, all of our brains change. So our brains age just the same way that we do, right? So just the way that our bones become more fragile, just the way that our joints sometimes have arthritis and become more painful, our brains change with age. So we don't have the same brain at age 80 that we did at age 25. Typically, our brains shrink over the course of time. Typically, our brains also receive less blood flow over the course of time. And the different little neurons, which are the different cells in the brain that talk to one another that help the brain work, they also don't function as quickly as they did when we were younger, okay? There are a number of different conditions or a number of different diseases that can actually cause symptoms like memory loss. So you could have memory loss that's due to the wrong combination of medications that you're taking. You can have memory loss because you have something like Alzheimer's disease. You can have memory loss because you've had a stroke. There are many, many different conditions that can cause some of the symptoms that we experience as our brain ages, okay? We talked a little bit about how these different diseases oftentimes cause physical changes to the brain. So the brain tends to shrink as it gets older. If we have some of these diseases, the brain actually can shrink much more quickly than it would otherwise. And some of these diseases, as thinking about our train example again, some of these diseases can actually cause dementia, which is an inability to live independently and care for ourselves independently because of a decline in kind of our thinking and memory skills. There are a couple of really big points I want you to take away from this brief time we have together. And this is the first one. Dementia is not part of normal aging. So yes, all of our brains change as we age. All of our brains age, but we should never get to a point where we actually cannot live independently because of how poor our thinking and memory has become, okay? So dementia is not a part of normal aging. It's never a part of normal aging. And oftentimes it's normalized as such. Oftentimes we say, oh yeah, mom or grandma, she just is a little more senile, but it's normal for her age. That's actually not the case. We have to really try to shift that thought process to understanding that dementia really shouldn't be happening, okay? So what is dementia? What is Alzheimer's? What is the relationship between dementia and Alzheimer's? So dementia, remember, and you can see it here on the left-hand side, dementia is just an umbrella term that specifically refers to a loss of memory or thinking abilities such that we can't live independently any longer. So we're starting to have interference with our day-to-day life because of how bad our memory and thinking has gotten. There are different causes of dementia or different types of dementia. So Alzheimer's dementia or Alzheimer's disease causing dementia is the most common type of dementia. Another very common cause is vascular disease. So having a lot of strokes and things like that, that actually can lead to dementia ultimately. And then there are some others that are less common. Lewy body disease leading to dementia. Folks with Lewy body disease often have very significant visual hallucinations, may have problems with moving around, things like that. There's also frontotemporal dementia, which again is a different type of dementia where folks often have really, really different types of behaviors and really significant changes in personality, for example. And then there's kind of a mixed case where you can actually get a lot of different things kind of pitching into the pot, and they actually result in dementia as well. Okay, so we've talked now about what is dementia. We've talked about how is dementia potentially related to Alzheimer's disease. What is Alzheimer's disease exactly, though? So Alzheimer's disease, this is the other one of the other big points I want you to take away from our brief time that we have this morning. Alzheimer's disease specifically refers to changes in the brain, essentially involving a buildup of two proteins in very high amounts. So there are two proteins in the brain called amyloid and tau, okay? And so we have them in different amounts during our brain over the course of our lifetime, but those proteins are kept in check. Our brain does a very good job of keeping them at a very certain level. For some reasons we still don't fully understand, some individuals start to develop much, much higher levels of these amyloid and tau proteins. And that is actually Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease just refers to these amyloid and tau proteins building up in really, really high amounts of the brain, okay? So it's different from dementia, right? Dementia is actually my thinking and memory has gotten to the point where I can't take care of myself any longer. Alzheimer's disease is just these changes happening in the brain. Yes, Alzheimer's disease often leads to memory problems and other thinking problems, but it doesn't have to necessarily, and it doesn't have to be that severe. So for example, I have many folks I take care of, they have Alzheimer's disease. We've done different blood tests and whatnot to show they clearly have Alzheimer's disease, but they don't have dementia. They're actually still living independently. They're still driving. Many of them are still working. Likewise, there are many people I take care of who have dementia, meaning they can't take care of themselves because their thinking and memory isn't so good, but they don't have any Alzheimer's disease. We've done all the tests to look in the brain for Alzheimer's disease, these different proteins, and there's none of it there. So just a couple of pictures to keep in mind. The picture on the far right here is a healthy brain. So this is a brain that somebody has donated after they've passed away. And you can see the brain looks nice and full and plump. You can see all the little different folds in the brain. To the left of the brain is unfortunately the brain of somebody who generously, again, donated their brain for kind of study after they passed away. But this person had Alzheimer's disease. You can see actually, this is the back part of the brain, which is kind of on the right-hand side of the brain. You can see how much smaller and how much more shrunken this is compared to the healthy brain. And likewise in the front, you can actually see the front part of the brain is much more kind of pointed and sharp compared to the nice kind of round and full front of the healthy brain. The pictures on the far left here are actually pictures of those two proteins that I was talking about. So these are actually pictures that were taken when they took very small specimens from the brain of the Alzheimer's disease individual and looked at them under the microscope. And what you can see is these dark kind of clusters here. These are actually the amyloid proteins building up. So these dark clusters here in the top picture that's more brownish and yellow, these are actually the amyloid proteins building up into what are called plaques. Down below it, we have a little bit of a different color in terms of the image. It's more purple and pink, but these are actually the tau proteins building up. So these little kind of streaky flame looking type of things, these are actually the tau proteins building up around some of the brain cells specifically. So this is what Alzheimer's disease actually looks like under the microscope. Right? All right, so let's take a step back. We've been getting a little bit into the weeds with different terms and looking at brain pictures and whatnot. Why do we care? Why does all of this matter? Let's go back to the initial train example, right? So the initial train example, healthy train, healthy brain, moseying along down the track, everything's good. Something changes such that the brain is not quite functioning the way it's supposed to. It becomes a runaway train or kind of a runaway brain. There's an opportunity to stabilize the brain function or stabilize the train, or unfortunately, sometimes the brain function may not stabilize or the train may not stabilize. The reason all this matters is because I would argue that this represents a crucial fork in the road. If we can identify why the brain function is changing, what specifically is causing the brain function to change, and adequately address it, we can basically stabilize the brain function and we can stabilize the train. If we don't identify what's going on though, and things just to continue to progress, we can't actually stabilize the brain function. We can't actually stabilize the train, okay? So thinking about the train example, this is really the crucial point. This point here about, the healthy brain becoming a less than healthy brain, we're still learning a lot about. We know a little bit, but we're not quite there. We have a lot of research and a lot of information about what causes changes in brain function as we age at this point, okay? So let's talk a little bit about well, okay, my brain function may be changing. How do I go about actually figuring out what is causing this change? So typically, if you were to go to see a doctor to talk about why your brain function is changing a bit, they would do a number of different tests and kind of procedures. So they would start with what's called a neurological exam. They might do what's called neuropsychological testing. They would ask you to probably get some blood tests done and maybe have some pictures taken of the brain. And then they might ask you to do a couple of special tests. So what are some of these things? Let's talk a little bit about the neurological exam. So the neurological exam would involve essentially a lot of just talking and dialoguing with the doctor. So the doctor might spend 20, 30 minutes with you, a neurologist that is, talking with you about when did you start noticing memory changes? Is it, impacting your ability to remember to take medicine? Are you forgetting how to get home? Things like that. The doctor might also do things like check your reflexes, check your balance, and this is all part of this neurological exam. The neuropsychological testing are more kind of pen and paper tests that you would do to check and see how is your memory functioning, how is your thinking functioning. So I have pictures of some of the tests here. This is actually a test where it's kind of like connect the dots, where you have to just go from number to number. So you go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, and you try to go as quickly and as accurately as possible. So this is one test the doctor might give you. The test down here is called the Benson Figure. The doctor might have you copy a picture of this and see kind of how much detail you can actually find in the picture to copy. And then he might ask you later on, do you remember that picture you copied? Can you try to redraw it? So those are all some of the, just some of the neuropsychological tests that the doctor may ask you to actually do. The one here up in the top right is actually a test to see how good is kind of your mind control. So what you're supposed to do here is you're actually supposed to shout out what color the word is in and not actually read the color itself. So for example, this is the word red, but it's a blue color. So you would actually yell out blue for this. You wouldn't say red. And this involves basically a lot of kind of mental control. You have to really be focused on this. Okay. So these are the neurological exam and neuropsychological kind of test components that you might see. What about some of the other things I mentioned? So oftentimes the doctor will ask you if you can have a picture taken of your brain. And the reason for this is because we can tell a lot from just a picture. So these are actually two different pictures taken. This is an MRI of somebody's brain, and this is a CAT scan. This MRI actually shows that this person's brain has shrunken a lot as they have gotten older. So you can see in this picture on the far left, these kind of dark areas, the dark black areas, and then you can see in contrast kind of the light gray and white. The light gray and white is actually the brain tissue, whereas the dark black areas, this is actually space where the brain tissue should be. So we can sometimes actually just see from an MRI, oh goodness, there's been a lot of shrinkage of the brain in different parts. It may be because there's something like these Alzheimer's proteins that are building up. We can see sometimes the same thing on a CAT scan if the changes get significant enough. There are new tests that we have, specialized type of CAT scans that actually let us see the Alzheimer's proteins in the brain. So remember, we looked at before the Alzheimer's proteins from a brain of somebody, but that person had passed away. We were looking at pictures under a microscope. We actually now have specialized CAT scans where we can see while somebody is living whether or not there are Alzheimer's proteins in the brain specifically. There are different blood tests actually now being developed for these Alzheimer's proteins that are very quickly going to be in the clinic and available. So you'll actually at some point possibly be able to go to the doctor and have a blood test to see if you have Alzheimer's proteins or anything else like that building up in the brain. But just like the train example where, a runaway train, there can be a problem with any sort of, the different components of the braking system, maybe a switchboard, et cetera. We look for other things. So we'll check blood for your thyroid. We'll check your blood also for vitamin deficiencies. All of these things can actually contribute to problems with memory and thinking, and they're easily addressable if we identify them. A couple of therapy implications. So these are two charts. The individuals who made these charts did a study where they looked at 1,500 folks who had been diagnosed with dementia. So diagnosed with basically memory and thinking problems to the point where they couldn't take care of themselves. And essentially they looked at all of the different causes of dementia for these folks and how many of these causes were potentially reversible or changeable, meaning they could actually make the person better. If you look at this, it's a significant number of individuals where they actually were able to change the dementia course a bit. So this is even a little bit outside of our train example, right? Where the train example was kind of like dementia is the end stage, there's no change. Depending on the cause of the dementia, you may actually still have the ability to change somebody's cognitive function a bit. So they found that in 25% of the people they looked at, they actually had what looked like dementia just because they had depression. In 18% of folks, it was actually medications they were taking that was causing significant memory and thinking problems. They looked at another group also of these same folks, people who had kind of a full reversal of their dementia, meaning, you know, you have dementia, you have all these problems with thinking and memory that are stopping your day to day. Can we actually get you back to where you were before? And 60% of the people that they studied, it was a smaller group, it was only 23, but 60%, it was the medications they were taking that were actually impacting their thinking and memory. So just the idea that we've got to spend the time investigating what is causing the change in brain function, because there is something we could potentially do about it. And it could be as simple as just getting you off some of the medications you're on. What about some of the other therapies though, right? So something like Alzheimer's, right? Alzheimer's, we know, you know, you can change different medications and whatnot. It may not make a big difference. On this picture, I know it's hard to read, there are over 100 individual therapies in this picture alone that represent the therapy pipeline, meaning these are all of the different therapies that are in development for Alzheimer's disease. So this was 2 years ago, so this has actually grown, but there are over 100 different medications that are in different stages of development for specifically for the management of Alzheimer's disease. And so we're getting closer and closer to having a better answer, a better treatment for individuals who have Alzheimer's disease. We're not quite there with a cure, you know, we're still quite a ways from that, but we're getting closer and closer to having something that actually works better than what we've been using historically. One of the big caveats to that is, well, if we don't actually know what's going on in the brain, if we don't actually know what's causing the changes in thinking and memory, how can we actually treat, right? So even if we have some of these new medications that are available, if you're not being seen by the doctor, if you're not actually getting a diagnosis, you're not going to be able to utilize these new medicines as they come out, okay? One final word, as I realize I'm a little bit short on time, I truly appreciate the talk immediately before mine, and it's partly because so often in the field of medicine, we separate a socio-ecological model of health from our actual health. And so what I mean by that specifically is that the environments in which we work, live, play, they have a tremendous impact on our ability to access healthcare resources, our ability to access things like healthy foods and other, you know, physical activity resources so that we actually can maintain healthy lifestyles. And so really there is more of an emphasis, and I'm helping with a team I lead at UCSF on trying to be more comprehensive with our healthcare. We have to address everything that's going on, not just from a medical standpoint. We have to address all of the social things as well, because we can't truly help people otherwise. I'll stop there with the final take-home message. If you or someone you know is experiencing any sort of changes in memory, thinking, brain function, you got to get evaluated. You can't put it off. It's not going to go away. It's not going to just magically get better. You got to talk to the doctor about it and figure out what's going on, because there are a lot of times there are things that we can clearly do about the change in memory function. I'll leave just my email address and my phone number here, and happy to entertain any and all questions. And thank you all for your time this morning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wendon, for this really important, very complex information, but you presented it to us in a very attainable manner. We do have a couple of questions for you. The first is, what causes the amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain? And is there something that we can do to avoid getting it?
Yeah, so this is part of that train example where, right, we have the regular train moseying along to becoming the runaway train. What happens at that stage that kind of makes the train a runaway train? And so we've been thinking about this in terms of amyloid and tau. The truth of the matter is we don't fully know. It's a combination of a lot of really complicated factors. So there's some genetic components to it. So if you have a first-degree relative who's had dementia, you are at higher risk. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it. It's not a one-to-one where if your mom or dad have it, you automatically will get it, but you are at a slightly higher risk. So we know there's a genetic component to it. There are a lot of environmental components to it actually as well. Whether or not you choose to do things like smoke, whether or not you're exposed to very high levels of things like air pollution, we're starting to find out and realize that all of these different environmental components, they actually impact your risk of building up this amyloid or tau protein. A lot has to do with medical conditions too. So how well we keep our physical health together and how well we take care of all of our other medical conditions, that actually impacts whether or not we will develop these amyloid and tau proteins. So if you have really poorly controlled hypertension, really poorly controlled diabetes, you're actually at much higher risk for the development of some of these amyloid and tau proteins compared to somebody who, takes care of themselves otherwise. How you can prevent it? A lot of it has to do with just healthy lifestyle. So trying to stay cognitively active. So the more time we can spend away from kind of the TV, just sitting and not doing much, the more time we can spend keeping our mind active, staying socially engaged, the better we can take care of our physical selves with physical exercise, and the better we can take care of our medical conditions and better we can take care of our sleep. All of those things are going to promote our overall health and well-being and help prevent and stave off those proteins.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know many people who swear by crossword puzzles, right? As in terms of keeping the brain stimulated and so forth. Our next question is, how does deep brain stimulation play into this topic?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating, really kind of area of work. So there is work going into this modality of therapy called deep brain stimulation, where essentially, in a nutshell, you wear something like a headband where you get essentially kind of deep brain stimulation through different modalities. And so there is some research to suggest that deep brain stimulation may help with cognition in very specific instances. I think I've seen some literature looking at, the link between kind of memory in some instances and deep brain stimulation. But the amount of deep brain stimulation they were administering in those different research trials and compared to what is actually feasible is very different. So they had people wearing, these headbands that administer the deep brain stimulation for hours upon hours each day. And after they stopped the deep brain stimulation, oftentimes there was kind of a return of the memory back to where it was before. So I don't think it's the cure. I don't think, it's the answer absolutely for memory loss, but it may at some point in the future, when it's refined enough, be part of kind of a comprehensive therapy package where you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, you make sure you take care of yourself, and all of these things combined are kind of used to try to promote brain function and brain health.
Wonderful. We have about 4 more minutes, Doctor, and about 4 questions.
Sure.
Okay. Any data on the effects of racism in addressing dementia and Alzheimer's diseases in communities of color?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there's more evidence and mounting evidence on the influence of kind of environment in terms of brain health, but there are individuals who have begun to look at what is the impact of larger structural and systemic factors on brain health. And so I forget her name, but she's actually from UCLA, if I'm not mistaken. She did some fascinating work looking at blood levels of inflammatory markers and looking at chronic inflammatory state and its relationship to lived experiences of racism. And so she actually found that individuals who had a lot of lived experiences of racism, they were walking around with chronically elevated levels of inflammation, which we know from a brain health standpoint, chronic inflammation also is not good for the brain. There's also some literature and some evidence to suggest that individuals who have experienced a lot of daily lived experiences of racism have lower kind of cognitive scores when we test them on some of these tests that I was talking about. But in terms of the actual brain pathology itself, I think the link between exposure to racism and other systemic influences and chronic inflammation, I think that's really where we're going to continue to discover just how detrimental racism and these systemic factors are for our brain health.
We always think of dementia appearing in the aged. Is there an age range that testing for prevention might be advantageous if we begin watching at age 20, 30? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think personally, from a public health standpoint and from a medical community standpoint, we are really far off in terms of our prevention and our preventative screening. So I think, truth be told, folks should be having, regular screening starting younger and younger. We typically, as you mentioned, and the question alluded to, don't start screening for cognitive changes until somebody actually mentions something. By then, oftentimes, there are a number of changes in the brain that have already happened. And it would have been better to have a baseline, an idea of where somebody was at beforehand, before they actually started to experience changes. And so, I think that there are many of us pushing for cognitive screening to really become of kind of an annual wellness visit. So, by the time you get to say 40 or 50, you start having annual wellness visits and have all these other screening modalities. Why can't we introduce cognitive screening then as well? So I think it's never hurts to get a baseline, especially if you're in your kind of 40s, 50s, it never hurts to get an idea of where you stand. Although, there's difficulties with that and intricacies to that just because of insurance and other things that may or may not allow for that level of screening. But definitely, if you're concerned, you gotta talk to the doctor. But screening is going to be incredibly important in the future, but it's going to take, I think, a concerted effort to get us to better screening practices and better screening guidelines.
A couple of more questions, doctor. Say a little bit about the process of finding out which medications are affecting our cognitive impairments. It's a long process around blood pressure, cholesterol. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. So I think with regards to really narrowing down what are the culprits in terms of medications, it helps oftentimes to have kind of an outside party look at things. So this is why talking with somebody like a memory doctor or a geriatrician can be very useful, because your primary doctor, your cardiologist, et cetera, they may be just very focused on specifically what they're managing, your high blood pressure or your sleep issue, whatever it may be. But nobody's taking a step back and really looking at, okay, you're on 17 different medications. Do you actually need to be on all these medications? And furthermore, are you using medicines that you really should be using? So for example, you're taking a little bit of Benadryl at night to help you fall asleep. That is not good for your cognitive health, especially as you get older. You're taking Ambien to fall asleep. You're taking all these different medicines, and it's not really being monitored with the level of kind of aggressiveness that it should be. And so I would say that with regards to the medicines, we all end up on medicines as we get older, but it helps to sometimes take a step back, talk with somebody who's outside, who has a fresh set of eyes, and just look at the list and go through, maybe this you don't need, maybe this you don't need. So that would be my suggestion.
Wonderful. I'm going to try and combine the final 3 questions, and you can take it wherever your heart leads you. Number 1, can you say a little bit if there's an increase in Alzheimer's diagnosis as a result of COVID and the inability to socialize? Someone wanted to get clarification on the comment around puzzles and card games and board games, and can they assist in keeping one from acquiring these brain diseases? And then finally, doctor, do you need a referral from a primary care doctor to get an appointment? And can a family member call to get an appointment for a patient?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I can tackle them kind of one by one and try to weave some interconnectedness between them. So between COVID and AD, so there has been a lot of news around the neurological effects of COVID. So we have seen individuals who have had COVID with increased incidence of stroke, and increased incidence of seizures. We also have seen this kind of brain fog phenomena among people who have COVID. And so there is something about getting COVID in and of itself that actually is probably not great for the brain. We still don't fully understand what that is. We actually have different research going on right now looking into people who've had COVID, who have kind of this brain fog and this difficulty thinking and memory afterwards. What is going on in the brain? What is happening? So we are studying that currently. I would say anecdotally, as a clinician seeing patients, I have absolutely seen the negative impact of a lack of socialization around the COVID time for people who have memory and thinking problems. So there are folks I've seen, where there's been a 2-year gap in between kind of when I last saw them. They've been basically stuck at home, not a lot of social engagement, and they have really deteriorated. Many folks are at a much different stage in terms of kind of their brain health. I had a number who were in more of kind of that stabilization stage, that mild stage. And more recently, I've seen them and they have full-blown dementia. And so I think that speaks to the power of routine, the power of really regular socialization. All of those things are so critical. Are puzzles the best? Not necessarily. Really, cognitive engagement can come in any way, shape, or form. It can come from reading the newspaper. It can come from, puzzles, as were mentioned. It can come from troubleshooting and figuring things out around the home, building things, cooking things. Anything that forces you to use your mind in kind of a more active way is going to help with cognitive stimulation. The one thing you just really want to avoid is the television. The more you sit in front of the TV and are physically inactive and mentally inactive, the more detrimental to your brain health overall. And then finally, the question about referrals. So this ties in actually a little bit to so many of the structural issues that folks face trying to get care for brain health. So we've been doing work and we've realized that individuals who really need brain health evaluations, really need brain health care, there are so many systemic issues in the medical system where they are just basically blocked out. And so I actually have a team I work with where if there are folks who are in the community who are concerned about their brain health, who need help navigating the entire medical process, getting a referral, all those things, we actually reach out to them and help them along the steps of the way with a dedicated social worker. So we do work with the primary care doctor to actually get the referral, but we have an actual team dedicated to this. So if anybody on the call is in that situation, you don't even know where to start, you're concerned, you need help, please, please, please reach out. I have a team of folks to help with this.
Dr. Winden, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for this incredibly valuable information and for your time and for your care. It is just incredible. Thank you. And you're getting lots of praise in our chat and on our question and answer as well. So thank you.
Sure.
And with that, everyone, we are going to make a transition to Sister Carla Keener. Hi, Carla. It's good to see you. Carla is a proud member of the Allen Temple Baptist Church and is an active member of the Allen Temple Health Education Ministry. And she will be talking about prizes and all of that good stuff and transitioning to our next set of presenters. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Dr. Littles, and we thank you for setting the standard for facilitating this program. So thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. God bless. Wow, everybody, what good information we've had already, and we have so much more in store for you. So while we all take a breath from this amazing high caliber information we've received from our first presenters, you still have time to share with your friends and neighbors and colleagues that this health fair is going on. So share it on Facebook, tweet, send people a text, because this is information that you're not going to get in any other place, frankly. So while you're doing that, I would like to introduce our Wheel of Words game to both thank you for joining us and also encourage you to stay with us. So we will have one spin of the wheel now and one at the end of the workshop. And to be eligible to participate in the Wheel of Words, we are using the credentials that you use to register via Eventbrite. So with that, we are going to spin the wheel. And someone will let me know who the name of the person who's the winner of the first gift card, which I believe is $50. So a nice prize. Well, congratulations, Maddie. We will get your contact information and make sure that you get your gift card. So thank you for being with us. And again, congratulations for being our first winner. So let us move on with the program. And again, we want to thank Sister Aziza and Dr. Wyndon. You guys were wonderful. So we're going to continue with our presentations. Next up, we have Dr. Rita Hargrave. Dr. Hargrave is a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist. She has extensive clinical experience in consultation liaison psychiatry, adult geriatric psychiatry, telepsychiatry, and cross-cultural mental health issues. She has published numerous research papers and book chapters focusing on the dynamic interaction of culture, aging, health, and wellness among older adults. She has been an invited speaker to numerous public education forums sponsored by the Veterans Administration Northern California System of Clinics, Stanford Geriatric Education Center, University of California, Davis, Alzheimer's Disease Center, and the Alzheimer's Association. Her most recent writings will appear in a soon-to-be-released book entitled Geriatric Mental Health Care: Lessons from a Pandemic. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Hargrave. We look forward to hearing what you have for us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to this forum. It's a wonderful way to spend a Saturday. It's so needed. And you've got, an amazing panel of people who are participating. So I'm relish the thought of being able to share more information. Now, my area is going to roll more specifically. I'll be sure if I got the share screen piece going. Let's see now if we can share screen. Let's see. This is always the biggest challenge for me. Will this work? Are people seeing this? The good life?
Not yet.
Let's see, let's try this again. So I'm going to do a share screen. And we got the screen, okay. Come on.
There it is.
Or something's coming.
Okay, so that's it. So that's coming up okay?
Well, we see your desktop, but not the.
Okay.
There you go. There you go.
Okay, here we go. So I'm going to dovetail with Dr. Wyndham's some of the things that he mentioned in terms of what are some of the things that contribute to Alzheimer's or other dementias. And I really want to actively have people think about their part in this dialogue, because I know there's a lot of discussion about, talking to the doctor and getting the doctor to change your medicines, but this is a two-way street. And like taking his train metaphor, hopefully the engineer has worked with the rest of the team to be sure that the train is in good working order before it leaves the station, that, the brakes work, that the engineer knows where he's going, and it requires vigilance and maintenance. And I'm suggesting that's exactly the same thing, that you as recipients of care are also contributors to your own health. So that's probably the biggest thing I want to get across. And we're going to talk a little bit later on what are some of the things that you can do to improve your brain health in particular. So we are, let's see. So we're going to look at some of the basics. No, a lot of people think that dementia or memory problems are part of normal aging. And I, again, want to underscore what Dr. Wyndham said, that dementia is not a part of normal aging, but there are things that make people concerned. So we're going to look at what's going on. So things that you may have noticed. The other area is to look at what are some of the 5 warning signs of dementia. And a lot of this was taken from the Alzheimer's Association, a website where you can get a lot of information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time about the types of dementia that there are, because again, Dr. Wyndham did such a comprehensive review of that I don't think we necessarily need that. But the big one in the bold letters are what you can do. And that's really the core of what we'll be talking about. Okay, so, and somebody can give me that 5-minute roll, because I think I got about 20 minutes and I'm going to try and keep into that time framework. So what's going on? How do you know if it's normal aging? Because as was said before, the brain does change with time, that you don't have the same way you don't have the same joints, the same muscles, the same brain that you had when you were 20. In some ways, that's a good thought, because we did a lot of stupid things when we were 20, which hopefully we've learned to avoid now. But things are, your whole body is different from your 20s to now, wherever you are, if it's 60, 70, 80. So in normal aging, you may not recall a discussion that you had or an event that happened a year ago or 10 years ago. And that's one of those senior moments that people talk about so much. And I love when somebody who's 45 talks about having senior moments. I say, okay, well, welcome to the club. This is your new life. So get adjusted to it. So not recalling something that happened a year or 2 years ago it may be part of normal aging. But in dementia, we're looking at details from a recent conversation, like something that happened maybe yesterday, or a conversation that you had earlier in the day. So that may lean more towards dementia and not towards normal aging. Now, another thing that comes up a lot is names. Many of us, as we get older, have trouble remembering the names of folks. I mean, I'll be going to a celebration today, a birthday celebration, and I know for a fact there are going to be people who I've seen over time, and I may not be able to pull up their names. But that's, again, not unusual as we get older. We got a lot of stuff packed in that brain, so it's kind of sometimes hard to pull out a name on the spot. But when we go over to the point of not recognizing the name of family members, or the fact that this person is your niece and not your daughter, that really is sort of kind of over the line and leaning more towards more serious cognitive decline, suggestive of dementia. So again, not remembering the name of an acquaintance that you may not have seen for a while versus not remembering the name of a family member, that's kind of the big difference between those two. Now, forgetting, because we're all worried about memory loss, and as Dr. Wyndham said, cognition is made up of multiple things, with memory being something that we're all concerned about, and I think is what gets people thinking more about dementia. So we may forget things, events occasionally, like I'm booked to do 2 or 3 things today, so I have to have my list of things out or I will forget something. But it doesn't happen every day, and it doesn't happen frequently. So when you go from forgetting things or events once in a while to this happening on a regular basis, that's again when we're thinking about more severe mental and cognitive changes that are suggestive of dementia. And I keep saying suggestive of. Okay. A couple more things with what's going on. Difficulty finding words. Like I'm sure in the middle of this talk, I will say, gosh, I can't quite find that word. And it may be something that word I use all the time, but it's going to happen occasionally. But when you find or you see someone who really has trouble finding words in a normal conversation often, and sometimes people will use fillers like, you know what I mean, as a filler for that word they can't find. And you're noticing that that's coming up more frequently. That's leaning more towards dementia symptoms than normal aging. And finally, I think this is a really key one. And it's just kind of a guideline. If you're worried about your memory, but your friends and relatives are not, that's more leaning towards normal aging, because we all are, worried about our health. We notice the changes, but other people may say, well, you seem to be doing okay to me. On the other hand, if your friends and relatives are worried about your memory, but you're not, that is leaning more towards dementia. If they're saying, gosh, we see changes, gosh, do you need any help? That kind of leans into that dementia spectrum. So getting more into the meat of what are the warning signs of Alzheimer's. And again, this is coming from the Alzheimer's Association, again, where there's a lot of information about that. And it continues to sort of build on what you've already been presented with today. So again, 5 warning signs of Alzheimer's disease. Troublesome memory loss. And as I said, memory loss that's really significant. Difficulty in planning. And planning can be something as simple as how do you pay your bills? And not everybody has, automatic deposits and automatic payment strategies. But in the old days, when you actually had to sit down and write a check, put it in the envelope, put a stamp on it, and put it in the mail. That's a lot of steps. So if, for instance, you may visit someone and they may have problems with paying their utilities or keeping up with things. So, and planning for daily activities, problems completing daily tasks is another one. Those are really more signs of pretty serious cognitive changes. Confusion about time or place. So people that may wake up in the middle of the night and not realize that it's actually nighttime. Difficulty judging space or distance. And I think this is a really key one with driving. Sometimes the first time that family members really have a sense that the person has had significant cognitive loss is when they ding up the car or they get into an accident. And that part of that is sort of physical, but a lot of it is the brain being in place to be able to judge space and distance. And Lord knows, as crazy as the streets are out there, it's really dangerous if you're having problems with this. I mean, I actually watched this happen with my dad, who went on to have cognitive problems, that there's a driveway that he had been backing down for decades. We had a really narrow driveway in the house. And I came home once and I saw that the driver's side mirror had been all smashed up and he taped it up. Now, he didn't say what happened, but since I am particularly aware of this, I asked him, so what happened with the driver's side mirror? Oh, just no problem. It's just, I wasn't looking. That was not true. And I knew it was not true. It was part of that decline that would ultimately lead to Alzheimer's disease. So again, the driving stuff, big issue. Okay. 5 more warning signs. Okay, so 5, if you had 5, then there's 5 more. Another warning sign is difficulty speaking or writing, or the kind of memory issues that, or tasks that you used to be able to do fairly frequently. Sometimes you can actually see a change if somebody is still using longhand. Occasionally, there are people who sign things. You can actually sometimes see a change in their signatures. You can see a change in if they're writing letters, for instance, that the number of words that they use are tend to decrease. Another one, if someone is bilingual, if they were originally using a different language than English, their ability to maintain their facility in English may go down, and they may start to revert to the language that they were born with more often. So finally, 3 more things to go along with warning signs. Losing things, and I don't mean just kind of losing your keys and they're in another handbag, but losing things and not being able to find them in your house, not remembering where you last were to be able to backtrack. I'm a big key loser, so I always look at this one in particular. And because this change in the ability to sort of track your behavior, to remember what's going on, to engage in conversation, that may lead to social withdrawal because that person recognizes they aren't as sharp as they used to be. It's more difficult for them to follow a conversation. They may stay away from being around a lot of people with a lot of noise because it's just too difficult, and they recognize it's become a liability. So social withdrawal and associated depression, we're talking about mood and personality alterations. There may be an increased level of depression, anxiety, and that sort of dovetails with that social withdrawal. So those are 5 of the or 10 of the top things to think about with Alzheimer's disease. I won't spend a lot of time on common types, because again, Dr. Wyndham was very comprehensive in terms of Alzheimer being the most common form of dementia, but that there are others. But I do want to focus on the issue of vascular dementia, because African Americans in particular have a higher risk for vascular dementia than whites. And that sort of is consistent with the other health issues that we struggle with. So if we're talking about high blood pressure, diabetes, obesities, all those things that lead to heart problems, that's also, they can lead to brain problems. And in terms of what you can do, which we'll talk about later, if you are really aggressive about managing your heart health, that also means you are addressing your brain health. So this kind of takes us down to we've got all these things swarming around that are potential warning signs that there are memory problems, attention problems, word finding problems. So what can we do? And this is where the dialogue and the empowerment that this talk, this series of talks, and hopefully others that you will attend, will help you sort out what can you do on your end. Top of the list, see your doctor, see your doctor, see your doctor. I mean, because so often we only go when, the train has actually gone off the tracks. If we go back to Dr. Wyndham's metaphor, that's when we go see the doctor, as opposed to seeing him when the train is still in the station and is there for maintenance and repair. And now it's kind of a mixed bag. We do have telehealth. We are able to do Zoom meetings, but it's so many physicians are not there. I mean, so many people have left the profession that it gets hard to get connected with the doctor. And I know probably everybody who's on this call has had the experience of you miss an appointment and maybe 6 months or longer before you can get a new appointment, or you need to change doctors, and it's really very difficult. But you do whatever it takes so that you are seen on a regular basis, and fingers crossed with the same team, if not the same doctor, with other people who are sort of aware of your overall health issues. Now, again, since so much of this is telehealth, that visit, which is short, and we know how short it is. I mean, sometimes they say it's on an average of 6 to 7 minutes you spend with your primary care doctor. Have your questions, your medication, everything in front of you so that you can refer to. So if you have issues that you want to get dealt with, if you have questions, bring a list so that you can use that time as effectively as possible. Any of the medicines that you're currently taking, if you don't have a list, have the pill bottles there with you so that when they ask you, so what did your last doctor give you to manage your high blood pressure? And 90% of the time people I talk with say, I don't know, it's that pill. Don't you know that blue pill? No, I don't know that blue pill. But so have a list of your medicines with you, and certainly when you have an appointment. And it never hurts to have a friend, because so much stuff can happen in those appointments. It's hard for you to remember all of what happened. And there may be things that you wanted to get addressed that you forget. So having someone, a friend, a family member, with taking into the issues around privacy, but I think it's extremely helpful. Now, as I mentioned, these modifiable risks for dementia are not just for dementia. They are for high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, respiratory, all of that stuff is relevant in terms of modifiable risk. So discuss that with your doctor. And I know there was some mention before about medications that may be interfering with your cognitive abilities. But also, if you're not getting decent sleep, that will also mean that you'll be, as was mentioned before, you'll be taking that Benadryl, you'll be taking that Ativan. So looking for another way of managing sleep that doesn't involve medications. That's a really clear one with that dialogue about how you can empower yourself to find non-pill related ways of dealing with common problems like sleep. And sleep is such an important issue for overall health, in particularly brain health. Also contact the UC Davis Alzheimer's Disease Center, because they have a lot of information. I have their website there. And in terms of another approach to the modifiable risk for dementia, what are some of the things you can do? And here's where we come to join the good life. And I'll talk a little bit more about the good life. Let's see.
Dr. Hargrave, just a couple more minutes. If we can get through the next few slides, that'll be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Modifiable risks, alcohol, drugs, alcohol, managing hypertension, obesity, all of these things are things that you can make some changes about. And if you want to make some changes, better food choices, improving your exercise regime, expanding your support network, finding spiritual nourishment. And the Good Life specifically is designed to help with food choices, exercises, and expanding your support network. It's an incredible program. People have found it's really changed their lives in terms of them empowering themselves about their health. So finally, check out the Good Life, exercise, nutrition, all this leads to brain health, feeding your spirit, and developing social resources to help us all age as healthy as possible. And I'll stop there. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hargrave. There's so much good information, and we could take any one of these topics and have a whole health fair, but we just want to try and get people enough so that they have good information to have conversations amongst themselves, their families, and with their care providers. We already have a question for you, so I'm going to go there. And Yvonne asked, at what age do you think it's time to see a gerontologist? Should we rely on our primary physician to refer us to one?
As soon as you, I'll go with Dr. Wyndham. I'll say 40, because not only, at least to discuss your concerns about about aging and what's happened within your family. It's never too early, but I think around 40 is when we are really starting to think about our trajectory and our timeline. And it's also by that time you may have already developed chronic health problems that can be addressed through lifestyle changes. Again, with our issues with high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, all of that stuff can well be in place by the time you're in your 40s. So that's when I'd start having that dialogue with your primary care doctor.
Another question about your 10 warning signs. Are they ranked or weighted? And is it one warning sign or a combination of warning signs when you should have some concerns?
I'd say it's a combination. It's a combination. And no, there's no ranking at this point. So again, the Alzheimer's Association just looked at what are the types of things that tend to pop up in terms of predictors and concerns that people have, common ones.
Okay, I'm giving people time because I know they're forming their questions. Having gone through this myself, what kind of advice do you give people who need to have conversation with adults, their parents, about the driving, about other things when they don't think there's an issue?
That's a very personal and a very complicated situation when that power dynamic changes, when you as the daughter or the cousin or the nephew are asking your parents or your grandparents to change the way that they operate their lives or to consider that. And I would send you directly to the Alzheimer's Association website, because they have a wealth of information about caregivers, concerned family members. They also have a hotline where you can get on the phone with somebody. You can also call the Alzheimer's Disease Center, because a lot of what we do is education and support for people who have someone who has memory problems. And it's very individual. And Black people, we're grown up to listen to our elders and not beef with them at all. But in this case, for their health, it's really important to be able to find a supportive way to assist them.
Great advice. Someone asked, does processed foods play a part in our cognitive behavior?
It certainly does. I think there's even a recent study that looked at people who have dementia as in their brains who did not have significant issues with memory. Those are the people who led the healthy lifestyle. They were not eating salami and Ritz crackers, and I love barbecue as much as anybody else. But healthy lifestyles, eating, being really clear on what you take in. And we are in California. We are the model for having access to good food, organic food, really being thoughtful about that. So yeah, all of that stuff that will interfere with your heart health. As I said before, your heart health is equivalent to your brain health. So if it's messing with your high blood pressure, your diabetes, it is not doing anything good for your brain.
Excellent. And the last question I see thus far, is the good life a space for just minorities? I'm a white person, I assume she says, and I understand the need for affinity spaces for Black and brown folks. I want to make sure I'm not taking up space that's not for me.
We got room under the umbrella for everybody. So yeah, come on down. Come on down.
Absolutely.
And bring a friend.
All right, that's all really great news. I think we're down to all the questions that I see so far. Dr. Hargrave, you have maybe 1 minute. Do you have a parting comment or advice you'd like to give the audience before we move to our next speaker?
Bring more people to this kind of meeting. Have more churches do exactly what's going on right now. And please contact us at the Good Life, the Alzheimer's Association. Those resources are there and they need to hear from you. There need to be more people like me. There need to be more people like us that are having these discussions. And it's going to be pressure from you that's going to make that happen.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation. We've learned a lot and we appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to our next wonderful speaker, and that is none other than our own Dr. Carmen Ward-Sullivan. She is an associate professor and program director of the entry-level and master's in nursing pre-licensure program at Samuel Merritt University. That's a mouthful. Dr. Ward-Sullivan was conferred her PhD degree, physiological nursing, at the University of California at San Francisco. Her research focus is symptom science. She has 4 publications regarding symptom science, symptom clusters in patients with breast cancer undergoing chemotherapy. She was a symptom science fellow through the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Ward-Sullivan has presented her research at the national, state, and local levels. Besides her role in academia, she has dedicated much of her career to community service, having served 4 years as a board trustee with the San Leandro Unified School District. Dr. Ward-Sullivan enjoys research, community health education, traveling, serving as a member of several local and national nursing associations, and as a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Ward-Sullivan is a native of Oakland, and we welcome you, Dr. Sullivan. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sister Carla. I appreciate the warm welcome, and thank you to Allen Temple Baptist Church, my church, and also to the Allen Temple Health and Social Service Ministry, Health Education Ministry, for inviting me to present on heart disease. Even though my research has been on cancer symptoms, there's also a connection there. So I'll share my screen here. And I want to make sure that you can see my screen. So hopefully you are able to see my screen.
It looks good, yes.
Okay, all right, perfect. So I titled this My Aching Heart, an overview of heart attack and symptom recognition in the Black community. And first, I'd like to just acknowledge the past briefly. We think about who started. I'm a nurse, of course, as you've heard. So I think about Florence Nightingale on the top far left, giving recognition to her and the work that she initiated many years ago. And then our first Black registered nurse in the United States, Mary Eliza Mahoney, on that top right. And then looking down the bottom there on the far left, that is my grandmother. And then my great-grandmother on the far right. These 2 women were not able to be educated formally due to, as we know, racial issues that happened during those eras. But they both served their communities in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and those farming communities, and provided health care as they knew it to be, and also serving as a nurse midwife. So I always like to just pause and recognize and appreciate what they've done, because I wouldn't be here in nursing if it weren't for their modeling. And an overview today of what we'll discuss is just the impact of heart attacks in Black community with an emphasis on Black women. And that's key because Black women do not often recognize the heart attack symptoms. And then also looking at risk factors associated with heart disease and describe a few preventative measures to reduce the risk of heart attacks. And I would be remiss if I did not say, here is Dr. Michelle Albert. She is the 2022 first Black woman president of American Heart Association. She's local here and works serving at UCSF. So let's talk about a ticker fact. Every 40 seconds, someone in the United States has a heart attack. That's every 40 seconds, and this is according to the CDC. Heart attacks are the #1 killer of all Americans living in the United States, but Black Americans have a higher mortality rate as a result of the heart attack than any other ethnic group. Because of COVID, we now know, we knew this early on, serving as a nurse at Summit Medical Center in the open heart unit and ICU for more than 30 years, We saw the impact and we understood what was happening, but COVID has allowed us to really see, wow, all of the disease conditions are impacting those that are in the lower SCS group, those who have racial and social structural determinants of health impact. So it's visible now, but yet most people do not recognize heart disease as the #1 killer of all Americans. And you can see in the third bullet, cancer is the second leading cause, but you may hear oftentimes people identify cancer as the leading cause of death. Despite many campaigns that have been pushed out to the communities, we are still not as knowledgeable. So we need everyone, including those of you on this webinar today, to help participate in sharing heart health education so that we can save our loved ones. If we think about the leading cause of death, which is #1, look at it for Black women. It's #1, of course, followed by cancer, stroke, diabetes. That's key, #1. And the same holds true for men. Non-Hispanic Black male, #1 is heart disease. And this is a picture of a heart map, and this was from the 2015-17 CDC report. And this heart map only shows women, the causes of heart disease deaths for women aged 35 and older. Look where the concentration area is. As we know in the South, and I always think about, wow, I know my relatives from the South, we enjoy the great foods, the high-fat foods that we love. And now knowing that, we need to steer away from that. But also look at California for women. That's pretty significant. And as I advance the slide to look at this heat map for men, you'll see that the death rates in California for men are lower than what we see here in this heat map for women. Still heavily concentrated in our southern states, as we know, but there's definitely a difference in California compared to women. So why is this important? According to the American Heart Association, even after multiple campaigns, Black Americans have higher mortality rates. There's also the lack of awareness. American Heart Association is great at doing these 10-year campaigns and research trends and looking at and investigating and surveying people to understand, what do you know? What does the community know about heart attacks? What's your awareness level? And you can see that the lower level of knowledge of symptom recognition and the impact on heart disease in Black women is higher. Black women do not recognize heart disease as being the #1 cause of death in the United States. And we have lower levels of recognizing heart disease as the cause of death compared to our counterparts. In addition, I'll talk about some of the highlights of the American Heart Association survey. And this is from 2019. This is pre-COVID. 10-year trends indicate awareness remains steady in older women, but there are critical gaps in younger women of color. And this is a cause for us to really beef up our efforts to get and make sure that our community members are educated. Women's awareness as the leading cause of death has declined significantly over the last decade. 65% of Black women in 2009 compared to now, 2019, only 44% of women are aware that heart disease is the leading cause of death, and they're less aware of the symptoms. The decline in awareness is observed across all racial groups, except for the women who are age 65 or over. Women with high blood pressure, which is a leading cause of heart disease, were 30% less aware than women overall as this leading cause of death. And continuing on with some of the survey reports, awareness, and I'm going to emphasize that again, awareness of heart attack symptom declined among all women, and 52% of women reported chest pain as a symptom. And that's kind of common. If you watch some of the Grey's Anatomy shows and some of the other heart shows and medical professional shows that come on, you would think that we would know that chest pain is a symptom, but yet here only 52%. 38% of the women reported shoulder and neck pain as a symptom, and 28% reported shortness of breath. That's key also. If we think about, well, when do we call 911? Well, it's up to 47% in 2009, but we did have an increase in 2019, 54%. So we know what to do to make that phone call, but knowing that aspirin is something that we should take and chew immediately, that's down from 23% down to 14% over the most recent 10-year trend. So the call out is, in this survey, alarm should be sounded to address this highly concerning trend among younger women and women of color. And one of the authors of this report, this was key to me. This signals an urgent call for organizations ranging from public health, government, healthcare professionals, to community organizations such as churches, what Allen Temple's doing today, thank you, and employers, to take the challenge with full gusto to inform women of their risk of heart disease. Preventing heart disease remains our #1 priority, and we should be as close to 100% as possible. That's key. Let's just pause for a second and take that in. #1, we should be at 100%. We're not there yet, and these studies have been going on for a number of years. The greatest declines in awareness, adjusted for education and income, were among Hispanic women with an 86% decline, Black women, 67% decline, and women between the ages of 25 and 34, 81%. And don't be mistaken, it's not just an older woman's heart attack symptom or experience. Younger women also have heart attacks. And if we look at 2019, women were more likely than a decade ago to incorrectly believe that cancer was the leading cause of death. We discussed this earlier, but you can see the figures here. This is troubling to me. As cardiac disease, I'm passionate about that. So get the word out. It's key. And additional studies have reported that younger age Black women have the highest risk factors for symptom intensity and the frequency, both prodromal and acute. And prodromal, and I'll get to that, but it also, I just want to say briefly that it means that these are symptoms that are very subtle that may present maybe a year or two, if not sooner, before the actual acute event occurs. And acute, of course, is the events happening right now. Body mass index was also an important factor to consider. Unusual fatigue and tiredness. That was the most commonly reported prodromal symptom. So we as women, especially Black women, we kind of brush it off thinking, well, I'm tired, but I just need to lay down and rest a moment, and then I'll get back up again and take care of everything else that I know I need to take care of. I'll put myself last and go in and see my medical provider maybe next week. These symptoms are building up over time. And also looking at shortness of breath and any chest pain discomfort was a greater percentage of recurrence in both prodromal symptoms and acute. Don't ever deny any symptoms that you're uncertain about. Get in to see your provider quickly. And this is just another way to present the decline. So in 2007, something great happened. We knew that we were providing education. Everyone's aware of the symptoms of a heart attack and that heart attacks are the #1 cause of death. But yet in 2019, pre-pandemic, something happened. Only 44% of people were aware. So let's look at the difference between the symptoms experienced between women and men. So we talk about, you may have heard your provider say atypical, acute typical, and atypical. Now there's a term non-cardiac symptoms. And so I don't quite like that term because it confuses people, in my personal opinion. And especially it may be more true for Black women and women of color. Atypical and typical chest pain symptoms, they are unique symptoms that may experience, such as unusual fatigue, shortness of breath, indigestion, anxiety, change in thinking, cough, racing heart, numbness, burning of the hands, fingers, vision problems, or any chest pain and discomfort. And if we look at prodromal symptoms, they're identified as intermittent warning signs and symptoms that change in intensity and frequency at the onset of a heart attack and progress to acute symptoms, which can be a year, 2 years, 1 month, a few weeks. Again, pay attention to the symptoms. Never, ever discount that. And if your provider says, oh, you're just tired, it's nothing, go home and rest. Question that, advocate for yourself. And if we look at men, what are their common symptoms? Well, we hear this often because many studies done many years ago were always on men. So we know that crushing chest pain in the center of your heart, of your chest rather, that feels like there's an elephant on your chest. We know those symptoms, but it's not necessarily true for women because the symptoms present slightly differently. We also know that men have the upper back pain and neck pain, upper body discomfort. Remember to ask people, if you say, are you having chest pain? Well, not everybody identifies it as chest pain. They may just say, I'm having upper back pain. I don't quite know what it is, but there's something happening. Or my arm hurts, or my neck hurts. I'm not quite sure. It's nothing. It's not chest pain, but it may be. Dizziness or shortness of breath are also symptoms, and heartburn, nausea, or vomiting. And here's another way to compare the major heart attack symptoms, comparing men on the left to women. And so this feeling of nauseous, lightheaded, unusually tired, it's more common in women, and we tend to brush it off. So what's happening as we have this chest pain and we know there's something happening in the center of our chest, down our left arm, in the middle of our back, our neck, we're short of breath, what's going on around the vessels around our heart? This schematic here on the left-hand side is just a picture of the the coronary arteries, and we have plaque buildup right here in the center, and it builds up over time. Some of the literature suggests that this buildup begins when children are, 5, 10, 11 years old. You begin to see the early signs of the buildup. And once this plaque builds up, it keeps building up. High-fat diet. Of course, we talk about the stress, environmental stress, structural racism that impacts us chronically. And over time, this buildup will eventually rupture and cause a heart attack. And you can see in this schematic on the middle section here, this darkened area, this is tissue necrosis or death, cell death, and that's an artery that's passing through here. And this is called an anterior infarct, where the muscle dies, if you will, lack of oxygen and blood supply. And looking at the diagram on the right side, you can see here, these are the coronary arteries here, but this is the area that's blocked, which looks like this area here. Can you imagine you're not getting blood supply or oxygen to this area of the heart, and it's causing the tissue to die? So what are the risk factors? We know many of our risk factors are modifiable. Look at high blood pressure. We can lower our blood pressure, right? Weight loss, exercise, finding ways to decrease the stress in our life. That's possible. It takes a lot of work, but I know we've had talks about mental stress and how do we get through, and COVID has definitely had an impact on mental well-being during this time, but find ways to decrease the stress. If you're a smoker, stop smoking, please. And if you're thinking about smoking, please do not start. Approximately 47% of all people living in the United States have at least one of these 3 key risk factors: high blood pressure, high low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, and smoking. These are modifiable. The other modifiable risk factors are diabetes, being overweight or obese, eating an unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, and drinking too much alcohol. And these are other risk factors here, many of which we have the power to change. So when your doctor says and puts the glasses down on the bridge of his or her nose and says, lose weight, go out and walk, listen, it's not just telling, he or she's not just telling you that just because. This is real. It will save your life. Let's talk about foods here for a moment. Eat foods high in fiber, low in saturated fat. Limit your salt and sugar intake. Now, I have to say that during COVID, the time that we've been staying at home and working from home, of course, I ate many things that I should not have eaten. I knew better, but I thought, well, it's just for a year. This is all I'm doing. But no, It caused a change in my cholesterol level. So that was the wake-up call for me to say, yikes, I am not immune from what can happen to everyone, of course. And so my doctor suggested that I go on a plant-based diet or a Mediterranean diet. And I did that for a year. And I went back and I had my blood work drawn again to find out, did the efforts that I made, did that help? And it did. There was significant decline. So it works. So listen to your providers. And just an important reminder about alcohol consumption. It can raise your blood pressure. We know that having hypertension is a risk factor leading towards a heart attack. So be mindful of that. And here are the recommendations. Men, no more than 2 drinks per day if you have to have a drink, and women, no more than 1 drink per day. Being overweight places you at a higher risk for heart disease. Excessive weight can put extra stress on the heart and blood vessels. Physical activity can help you maintain a heart-healthy weight and lower your blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood sugar levels. The latest research is suggested that we spend at least 150 minutes or 2 hours and 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, like a brisk walk or bicycling. That equates to 30 minutes, 5 days a week. I think most of us can do that at least 5 days a week. That's 15 hours out in the morning if you're headed out to work or walking your dog, and then 15 minutes back home. That's easy to do. Cigarette smoking, again, increases the risk for heart disease. And again, if you don't smoke, don't start. I want to just mention briefly also Takotsubo syndrome. This is a syndrome of a broken heart. You may have heard that mentioned before. This is triggered by intense emotional or physical stress. Symptoms include chest pain or shortness of breath, nausea, vomiting, weakness, high blood pressure. These symptoms mimic a heart attack, and you can see by this schematic here. This is the heart, but yet the change in shape there is significant. And this is the Takotsubo vase that it was named after here. It looks like a vase. So not only does the heart attack cause symptoms on the exterior, anterior, posterior wall of your heart, but also it changes the shape. So be aware of what's happening in your body. Don't ignore the signs and symptoms. So now, what can you do? Number 1, spread the word regarding heart health. Know your numbers. It's simple to walk into any drugstore, participate in a health fair, go out and get your blood pressure checked. Have your cholesterol lipid panel checked as well. Maintain a healthy heart. Develop exercise routines such as walking 15 minutes out in the morning and 15 minutes back home and the next day. Practice mindfulness daily. There is so much literature out there that really suggests the changes in the brain and how it impacts your body about this mindfulness. I'm a praying woman, so I will spend my morning praying first before I start my day. This changes how you go out and face what you're facing in the world today. There's also an app called Calm. I have it on my phone. It reminds me to take a nice deep breath when the day is stressful. That's important. Minimize the stress in your life. It's hard to really think about that. How can we minimize our stress? But there's so many ways now that you can, and different organizations that are offering ways on how you can decrease the stress and help your body. Change your dietary habits. Add more plant-based food groups to your daily meals. And pay attention to any and all symptoms. You matter. And if we think about racism as our theme for today, Black women and Black men may present to their provider and just are very vague in how they describe their symptoms. And they may be sent home with, well, just go rest. You know, it's okay. Come back and see me if the symptoms get worse. Truly advocate for yourself, because these are our key symptoms. You're important, you matter, your family loves you. I have to just share a story about a young woman that was coming to our hospital, Summit ED, emergency department, many years ago when I was working in the ICU. And this is a young woman who had young children. She had chest pain, but it was just, the way she described it was very vague. Those symptoms were vague. So they waited as they were treating her in another city. Because at that time, Summit Medical Center was one of the key cardiovascular centers in the East Bay area, in Oakland, I'll say. And she was transferred to our hospital. And she was coming through the Highway 80 corridor as a code 3. That's an emergency. They're coding her in the rig, if you will, en route to our hospital. We were prepared to take this person and really treat her and prep her before we're taking her down to the cath lab. The cardiologist was available. I kept getting updates as to where they are, the rig, and when they'll arrive. And unfortunately, this young woman didn't make it. She died in the rig before arriving to our hospital emergency room. I wonder if she had symptoms prior to that event, the acute event, and just did not recognize them or push them off as, I'll go take care of myself later. Again, you matter, it's important. And I also want to add one other story when I think about racism, the theme of this, that we at Samuel Merritt University in the College of Nursing, I, along with my team members, we're working on creating a course that will be brand new. It's early stages, and we're going to cover the topics of racial, cultural, social justice, structural, and social determinants of health so that we can better equip the next generation of nurses, nurse practitioners to provide excellent care to you when you present to the ED or to the clinic office and describe your symptoms so that everyone is aware and can provide better treatment for you. Thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Dr. Carmen, that was amazing. So much that you've talked about is so important to us, and the new course you described demonstrates why representation matters. So we look forward to hearing more about that course and how we can continue supporting you and Samuel Merritt. Before we get to the questions and answers, remember, folks, that in addition to this wonderful information you're receiving, we want you to stay to the end of the seminar. So please hang on, because we have those drawings for 2 more gift cards. So hold on. The first question: does plaque lay down differently in women than men in the vascular system?
Not to my knowledge. Plaque is plaque. High cholesterol is high cholesterol. It builds up over time. So no, that does not. I think about when we used to draw blood on patients newly admitted to our ICU. And in just that vial of blood that we see, you can see the yellow plaque rise to the top of that vial. So before the test is even run on that, we knew this person's cholesterol would be pretty high. Great question, though.
Next question: what if you know someone who's had 2 heart attacks and is a smoker and won't listen? Any suggestions for convincing them to change?
That's huge, because we know that smoking causes the nicotine in the smoking causes the vascular to spasm. And so it can mimic a heart attack. And maybe that person's accustomed to, well, it's nothing, I'm not going to go in. I would say continue to provide the literature, show examples of what you need to do. There's so many handouts, but it's oftentimes it's not until the person is ready to recognize those symptoms that they will go in. But showing that person love and care, go with them, volunteer to go to the doctor with them.
Thank you. From our own Deacon Johnson, he asked, Dr. Sullivan, does racism and the systemic issues that confront Black women and men of the South, noted on the map you displayed, contribute to the higher rate of heart disease besides the unhealthy high-fat food consumption that is traditional intake of the South?
Wow, that's a loaded question there. And I believe that it does, but I also know that it's the lack of access to care, lack of a provider who may not look like you, who may decide, it's just go home and rest. Also, it's the environmental factors. It's years of chronic exposure to stress over time that impact us. So that would be my best answer to that.
Thank you. That was great. I'm sure folks are thinking about your presentation and probably may have more questions, but we're going to move on so that we stay with our schedule. And again, we thank you for the information and the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our next star panelist, and that's our own doctor. We claim her as our own, Dr. Nailah Thompson. She specializes in internal medicine at Kaiser Permanente East Bay. She's the Director of Internal Residency, Health Equity and Disparities Track, Site Director for Community Medicine and the Health Disparities Fellowship. Dr. Thompson is a passionate community worker, and in her own words, she says, I've been trained to look at the person as a whole and help my patients achieve a high level of wellness by incorporating not only their bodies and the medicines they take, but also their lifestyles and community into their healthcare. During my training in internal medicine, I began to see many people with chronic diseases and complications that could have been prevented. I decided to focus my training on preventive medicine and chronic disease prevention. This desire led me to New York City, where I completed my MPH, Master's in Public Health, at Columbia University and worked at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I want to help my patients remain healthy rather than waiting for them to get sick. And for this reason, I have decided to focus on health promotion and disease prevention. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Thompson. We look forward to hearing what you have today.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me back, and thank you for that introduction. I haven't heard that one in a while, so it's really nice to reflect on that and and make sure that I'm continuing to do those things that I wanted to do. So I'm going to share my screen. And can someone just give me a thumbs up if they can see my slides, please?
They look good. Okay,
great. Thank you. All right. Well, I shared these pictures, and some of them are from our previous health fairs there at Allen Temple. When we bring our entire team out, people are able to bring their families. We have our physicians, our pharmacists, many of our team. We've even brought our huge mobile vehicle to do actual visits. So we really look forward to the time, hopefully next year, when we can be back in person. And I just wanted to highlight that, yes, I heard a lot of things that I hope my talk will kind of tie together. I'm an internal medicine physician, which means I am people's adults primary care doctor. And so I hope I do see you while your train is still operating well on the track. And I hope that I would see you often to talk about some of these screenings that the many amazing speakers before me have mentioned. I also am board certified in preventive medicine, and you'll hear me talk about why I think it's important that, especially for our Black and Brown communities, we're focusing on how we can prevent people from getting sick rather than waiting till they're sick and then giving medication. Medication is necessary and some of us need it, but it's also better to prevent. And then I'm also board certified in lifestyle medicine, which focuses on how I can live my healthiest life. And Dr. Ward-Sullivan just mentioned a plant-based diet, which is one of the foundations of lifestyle medicine. So I just wanted to take one small step back, and I apologize if I speak a little quickly, but I want to make sure we get through this and give time for some questions. I just wanted to make sure everyone's clear on what we're talking about as we continue to talk about health disparities that we see, and that this is not something that we just are anecdotally talking about. These are differences in treatment, differences in diseases that we see in different groups, in different racial and ethnic groups. And it's related to opportunity. It's related to where we live, work, play, and pray, I like to add. It's related to access to healthcare and the quality of the healthcare we get. But it's also related to things beyond healthcare and those social determinants of health that have been mentioned. So we have to think back all the way to what happens before we're born, what happens when we're children with our schooling, what kind of foods we have access to, etc. We've also seen disparities in the type of care that's provided to different groups, and we'll talk about why. I just want to, for one moment, make sure everyone's clear. We keep hearing people say that African Americans have more heart attacks and we may have more strokes. This is not because innately within us, there's something wrong that makes us have these conditions more. We're going to talk about systemic racism a bit and how the systems that are in place in this country actually result in these disparities. So it was mentioned earlier in the opening about the huge disparities we saw during the COVID pandemic in this country, where Black and Brown communities got COVID more, were hospitalized more, and died from COVID more. And this is not because in our bodies we process the virus differently, and we can think about, we don't have time to talk about it now, but there are many reasons why many of our communities had to continue to go out during the isolation, had to continue to use public transport, may have lived in more dense areas. I will never forget the pictures in New York City when the lockdown first happened, but you still saw the subway filled with Black and Brown people who were still on their way to work, and we continue to see those differences. These differences are not new, but COVID highlighted them. These differences are also not just in health outcomes, which we have been focusing on today, but they happen in many, many social outcomes as well. I'll talk about that as well. And during COVID, we saw this just the same more economic hardship in our brown and Black communities than white people. This happens in young and old. That's important to know. It happens with many, many disease processes. We've heard about dementia. We've heard about behavioral health disparities. I'm going to talk about high blood pressure and stroke. There are disparities in diabetes, and they happen earlier in African Americans. They happen more often. They're often more difficult to control, and there's reasons for that, which include chronic stress, which has been mentioned, which include not having the same access to healthy foods and medical care. So we, as African Americans, are more likely to die at earlier ages from all causes. So that goes for what we just heard about heart disease, but so many things, including cancer deaths, COVID deaths, and I could go on and on. This is not just seen in adults. We start to see these very stark differences before life begins. There's been lots of news media coverage recently about maternal and child morbidity and mortality in pregnant moms and babies, and that African Americans are much more at risk of these outcomes. So I don't have time to truly address the causes of these health disparities, but I am going to say that it's multifactorial and complex. It involves many, many challenges at many, many levels of the society and our organizations and individuals. And this was already alluded to in the opening session, but I do want to say that there are many, many things that are contributing to these disparities. I think when people talk about racism, often we're thinking about kind of interpersonal racism when one person is being racist against another person. Also was addressed was internalized racism, and I will just take a moment to say that is key because it affects how we think about ourselves. And sometimes, unfortunately, living in American society as African Americans, we've been socialized to believe that we are less than, that we have to do more to get the same because we are not given the same opportunities, and that can result in how we feel about ourselves. The opportunities we pursue can affect our health as well. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on the structural, institutional, and cultural racism, which is really talking about policies and things that affect our health. I did just want to say there's been lots of talk about, individuals and how doctors can result in these disparities. That is a real thing. We know for a fact, first of all, that we all have bias. If you have a brain, you have bias. So that means your doctor has bias. But part of healthcare now is really educating people about these biases and educating people about the history of racism in medicine in America that has continued and continues to affect our communities. We won't have time to talk about that today. So Dr. Kamara Jones was mentioned earlier. She's a wonderful woman, and I have learned so much from her. She talks about structural racism, again, when we're thinking about policies and practices, cultural norms that reinforce the inequities in our communities. And so it can sound like a lot, and I'm going to try to give a few examples of what that means. But we know that if the country is built on this, and if people are socialized into these types of systems, then when we build institutions, we can see racism within the institutions as well, and that can be within healthcare. And this is just to show that there's definitely data that shows that structural racism is resulting in health inequities. So I'm going to give you guys some real examples to drive this home about here where we are. So this is Oakland, and if we look, the darker the color, the younger we die, basically. The darker the color, the younger you die. So we see that if we look at the difference between the Oakland Hills and the Piedmont area to areas like West and East Oakland, there's as much as a 12 to 14-year life expectancy difference in Oakland. And you can live more just by living in that area, you will live longer. We can talk about why that is. We can drive it home to children as well, because we have to be honest about what we're facing. And as we talk about hypertension and stroke, we cannot avoid thinking about the systems in place that make it hard for us to control these things. So we have to look at the fact that if we look at a child, an African-American child born in West Oakland, they are expected to live 14 years less than a white child born in the Oakland Hills. And to drive it home a little bit more, if you look specifically in West Oakland, an African-American child born in West Oakland is still expected to live less than a white child born in West Oakland as well. And that gets to the chronic stress we've talked about, the effects of chronic racism on our health, and the access to many of the things that some of our neighborhoods don't have. So 85 years for Oakland Hills, 71 years for West Oakland. Now, when I talk about policies, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, but this is to show how actual laws can affect our health. So many of you are very familiar, I'm sure, with 580 and the 880. And you may know that on 580, you are not able to drive an 18-wheeler truck. But all 18-wheeler trucks have to go through 980 and down 880, which goes through West Oakland and through more high poverty neighborhoods. And this is purposeful, and there has been attempts to change this. But those people who live to the left of 580 in areas like Piedmont and Oakland Hills have fought this because they don't want the particles that come from the diesel of the trucks to affect their health. And so why is it that we see higher levels of pollution in areas where we have higher poverty? And this is where we see the same disparities. We can go back even further. You guys may have heard of a system called redlining in the past, back in the 30s, when home loans were not given in areas where African Americans live. Those areas were marked as red, as not a good area to give loans. The green areas of places like Piedmont and Oakland Hills were green and better loans, and have resulted in continued differences in wealth, home ownership, and health outcomes. And I'll show you that now. So if we look at Alameda County, I'm going to just show you quickly some maps, but you'll notice that it's always darker in the same areas, which are often the areas where we have minorities living, and lower everything I'm going to show you. So we see that health disparities are in certain areas, and if we look, we see them in West Oakland, East Oakland, Richmond, Hayward. We also see that those exact same areas are the same areas of highest poverty. So we can tie health inequities to higher poverty. We also see those areas are the same areas of unemployment and lower educational attainment and renter housing burden, which means that those are the areas where we don't own our homes. So the reason I have presented this is for us to think about, when I talk about hypertension and stroke, the focus a lot has been on what am I doing and what is my doctor doing, but we also have to think about how are the systems supporting us? How do these areas have healthy access to food, which is key for taking care of your heart and your hypertension and stroke? Does it have quality education so that you can succeed? We talked earlier about the representation of physicians and mental health providers of color. We definitely want to focus on the pipeline, but we have to make sure those students are set up for success to first graduate from high school, then get to college and medical school. So this is a systemic issue that we must address if we are truly going to improve the health of our communities. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I do in regards to hypertension. We have a blood pressure clinic here in Oakland that I started about 7 years ago at Kaiser Permanente that specifically focuses on African American patients with hypertension. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what high blood pressure is, which is also called hypertension, because that helps some people to understand. And sometimes with high blood pressure, you feel nothing. You may have heard the sound, it called the silent killer. So just know that the red cells going through our arteries, pumping from our blood, puts the blood pressure strain on the arteries. And as you have high blood pressure, those arteries, the walls get thicker. So it's harder for the blood to circulate through your body, and the heart has to work harder against the pressure when you have high blood pressure, and the blood pressure may not flow as easily through those vessels. So this is why high blood pressure is a problem. This is why it puts us at risk of heart disease, heart attack, and stroke, as we'll talk about. Now, there's lots of numbers that you'll hear about high blood pressure. I'm only going to give you one today to remember. That's 140/90, because if your blood pressure is consistently higher than 140/90 and you are not able to get it down with lifestyle changes like plant-based diet, exercise, stress management, then that's when we recommend you start medications. Historically, 120/80 is normal, and people with high blood pressure may not get to 120/80, but ideally we want you closer to 130/80 to lower your risk of heart attack and stroke. Why is this important? Because having high blood pressure puts you at increased risk of many things. Stroke, I'll talk about. Vision loss, it's a huge cause of blindness. Heart attack, we heard about in heart disease. Heart failure, which just means that your heart is no longer, it's been working so hard against resistance that it becomes floppy. kidney disease and kidney failure. Some of you may know people on dialysis, and then it can also cause sexual dysfunction. Going to talk for a minute about stroke. There's different types of stroke. We heard about the plaque in the last talk, and stroke is basically the similar thing going on in your brain. And so the blood flow, because of the plaque buildup, cannot get to your brain, and it causes a clot that limits the blood, and that is an ischemic stroke. There's a separate kind of stroke where you bleed, which is called a hemorrhagic stroke, which is also related to high blood pressure. And so there's two different types. There's ischemic where the blood's not getting to your brain, and there's hemorrhagic where you have a bleed. For stroke, I just want to make sure that we are all clear that if you have a stroke, it's an emergency, and you must, at that very moment, call 911 or go to the ER. Some things to watch for, we now are using Be Fast, a loss of balance, if you have vision changes, if you have your face droop on one side or the other, if you feel weakness of your arms or leg, usually on one side of the body, if you have difficulty speaking, and you must immediately get care, because really in this case, we can help you often, but we need to do it within hours. So you should not go to bed and see how I feel the next day. If you have these symptoms, you need to call right now. A few of the things that I just wanted to mention, this is not just about giving you a medication and you taking it, as I mentioned. There's been plenty of talk about stress and how that affects us, and it affects our blood pressure. I wanted to mention foods. We talked about processed foods in the previous talk. If we put healthy things into our body, like fresh fruits and vegetables, and if you eat meat, fresh meats that are not processed, they're going to help us be healthier. I understand that many are on a lot of medications. We may not understand what our medications are for, and that is the job of you when you go to your doctor to ask those questions. Don't feel bad to ask that question. The doctor needs to explain that. And then I'll talk a little bit about why it's so important to trust your doctor, to form a relationship with your doctor, and finally, exercise. Did want to talk for a moment about salt, because salt is the main driver of our blood pressure. And many of us say we don't add salt, and some people mean they don't add it after they cook. Some people do use salt to cook. I will say that all salts raise your blood pressure. So whether it's sea salt, pink Himalayan sea salt, any salt is going to raise your blood pressure. Garlic salt. Also check your seasonings, because things like lemon pepper have a lot of salt. And know that you get it from processed meats like lunch meat, sausages, hot links, bacon, and things like condiments, especially soy sauce, is a big, big source. Now, most of us get it from foods prepared by someone else, whether that's in a restaurant, whether it's a 5-star restaurant, all the way down to fast food or Trader Joe prepared meals. They all have lots of salt, and you want to watch that if you have high blood pressure or not. Just wanted to make sure that we know it's best to use an upper arm blood pressure monitor and not the ones that work on our wrist, because they're less accurate. And there are important things to know when you're taking your blood pressure to give us an accurate reading. So you want to be in a calm place, having gone to the bathroom with your back supported, your arms supported, and you want to not put your cuff over clothing. You don't want your legs crossed. You don't want to be talking or on your cell phone, and you don't want to have coffee within 30 minutes, and hopefully you don't smoke at all. We talked about how we can prevent heart disease, same things. I mean, it's really important to think about how I can make healthy choices every day. This is reduce salt to less than 5 grams daily. I recommend lower than that, but that's a good start. Exercise, not smoking, not eating processed foods. If you drink alcohol, we talked about the healthy levels. I encourage you to focus on keeping them down. It's good for your blood pressure, it's good for your heart, it's good for your liver, and being physically active every day. Finally, I just wanted to say we have other events which are virtual, similar to these, that you can sign on to. And I know many of you have joined us there to continue to educate yourself and learn about your health, your family's health as we go forward. That is a key step to our communities being healthier. Now, I just wanted to finish with talking about the fact that when we talk about all these disparities, when we talk about this, we have to acknowledge the history of racism in America and the history of racism in the medical field. And so we're well aware about, well, I won't say we're well aware. Some of us are well aware about the history of racism and things like the Tuskegee experiment, and that many things that unfortunately that we did in medicine for long years began in slavery. And so in order to move forward, which was one of the questions earlier, we as physicians have to continue to educate ourselves about what has happened. We have to meet our patients where they are without judgment. And for some of us, we are from the same community. From some of us, we are not. But it is our job to meet our patients, to learn about them, and to treat them without judgment, help them make the best choices for their healthcare. I also want to acknowledge this is not history. This is not just history. And systemic racism affects us not only in healthcare, it affects us in the justice system and police brutality. It affects us in education. It affects us in everything that we do. And so I take just one moment to acknowledge the people on this slide and the many others who have lost their life in regards to police brutality. And this is killing us as well. Gun violence is another public health crisis that we're dealing with. We just saw this recently, and we have to continue to hold our elected representatives and all of ourselves accountable to talk about these things if we want our health to improve. I just wanted to say this is not just about health. We see these things happen differently in the media, where in this case, after Katrina, the white people were finding food from the grocery store, but the Black person was looting. So as I end up, I know I talked about a lot, but I want you to remember that 80% of your health is determined by things that happen outside of the healthcare system. So not the medicine I would give you, not the labs I would order, but the things I've talked about. Are you eating healthy foods? Is your neighborhood safe? Are you able to sleep at night without worrying about the safety of your children? Is your educational system for your children quality so that they have the opportunity to graduate from high school and get the education they desire after that part? And so, you know, someone mentioned earlier, what things should we be thinking about? And so I just think I do want to say that, again, this is not about us as African Americans being less than genetically. This is about thinking about where we live and how that sets us up for health. And so these are some of the things that we need to have good health. Safe neighborhoods with healthy foods, good school, clean air. I talked about how in some of our neighborhoods we don't have that. Quality housing that is stable, and food that is stable, good jobs that allow us to advance. And we see in some of our neighborhoods, we don't have that. So it was mentioned earlier that we need to shift how we think about caring for people. And I won't talk about this in depth, but what I will say is I hope that healthcare continues to shift to think upstream, which means thinking about all those things I just mentioned, thinking about how to support people. Then we focus on the behaviors that we have always focused on. What is the patient doing? But are we doing our part to give every patient the best opportunity for health? Also, I think we have to all hold ourselves accountable. This is myself here in my organization. After George Floyd was murdered, I hosted an event to remind all of my colleagues the importance of Black lives and that racism is a public health crisis. We all have our platforms. You have to figure out what makes sense for you to make a difference. If we all make small differences every day, we will get our hypertension better controlled, which will help us to have less stroke, which will help our children to be healthier. And with that, I will finish with my final slide, which is my why I do this. This is my son who was born during the pandemic, Naeem. He is the reason I do this is because I want this world to be better for him so that he will not be judged by what he looks like, that he will have the opportunity to be healthy, and he will have the opportunity to do whatever he wants, whatever job he wants, that he will continue to be thought of as cute, because I know because he's tall, already 99th percentile, that soon people will see him as a threat. And this is why I do this work for all of us and for Naeem. So thank you for listening. And with that, I will take a few questions.
Once again, you've done it. And that's why we love you so much, Dr. Thompson. That was amazing. You brought so many of the themes together: the ecological model, again, social determinants of health, the need for prevention and early intervention, and working in partnership. So while people are catching their breath from that ride, once again, we want to encourage people, please, please, please stay to the very end, not just because of the two $100 gift cards that we'll be raffling off, but we also want to get a survey to get your feedback on how we can continue to have these conversations of what subjects you want to hear. So with that, and you must be present. I'm sorry, you have to stay to the end to be present to get the gift cards, but we also want to hear from you in terms of the survey. So let's see what questions have already rolled in for you, Dr. Thompson, Naeem's mom.
Right.
Your why. What are your thoughts on what can be done to change the perceptions of many African-American folks discouraging people not to take blood pressure meds because they have to go on dialysis?
Wow, that's a great question. And I think in general, we try and educate. A big part of the way I care for my patients is educate them about the disease. So actually, patients are not going on dialysis because of the medications. They're going on dialysis because of the high blood pressure damaging their kidneys. So we have to understand that part. It makes sense in our brains. Once I went on the medicine, then I went on dialysis. But the medicines are trying to reverse the causes and the damage from the high blood pressure. So I think we have to focus on education, helping people understand their disease. Again, acknowledging that the fear of medications is real and that in our country, there's been misuse of medications. And the fact that in the past, there's been missteps when science said, oh, use this on Black people, when we know, again, this is not genetic. So I think we have a lot of healing to do, and we need to go backwards, take a step back. You need to find someone you trust who, that's probably most important, who you trust the doctor so that you trust what they're recommending, because if you don't, we're in trouble.
Great. This is an interesting question, what might speak to how we use our platforms. Someone asks, do you think we should participate in the census?
Yes, I do think we should participate in the census. Listen, the census determines the resources that are given to our communities. So we need to have accurate numbers of where we're living and what is there, because again, all of this speaks to mistrust. We don't trust the government. There's good reason we don't trust the government. But if we don't participate in the census, that we will not get the funding we need for our schools, for our parks, for our green spaces, for healthy things in our communities. And so I do recommend from a public health perspective that we participate.
Here's another question that's something that resonates about kidney disease and blood pressure medicine, something about the connection between kidney disease, kidney failure, and birth, delivery, things happening in delivery.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'll say about that is, unfortunately for Black women, we are more likely to die in birth regardless of our poverty level. And I will share very briefly, I almost died when I had my son. And part of it is women, Black women are not seen, heard, and valued. I had all of my prenatal care. I did everything I was supposed to do, but we have to get to the root of systemic racism where we are not valued and we are not heard. So when I was saying something's wrong after I had my son, I was hemorrhaging, nobody was listening to me, and I crashed and I got taken back to surgery. That is just an example of the fact that we are at a risk. It's not about, did I do what was right? I'm educated, I'm actually a doctor. I knew how to take care of myself. But if we don't have systems in place that support us, then we're in trouble. And then the second piece of that is, does everyone, because I am very privileged and very blessed that I do have the life that I could have all my prenatal care and I could have healthy food. Everyone doesn't have that. So how do we support those people who don't?
Great. We have a question about your thoughts about participating in clinical trials, African Americans in clinical trials.
Yeah, that's a great question. Here's what I'll say. I think we're making progress in America in including more Black and brown people in our trials. Historically, that was a huge issue where we were not included. And I can tell you for a fact, more recently with COVID, I did some events with Allen Temple. When we looked at the vaccines, we were included in those trials so that we know, so that the question is it going to work on me, basically? So I will say that we are making progress and that we are being included. I think if it's appropriate and it's something you want to do, it can be helpful for our communities to be included.
Dr. Thompson, you're clairvoyant because someone asked about vaccine hesitancy and what you would say to folks about that. So if you can expand on that.
Thank you for that question. This is really important. COVID has been a tragedy for our communities. And again, it all gets back to mistrust. And I know I sound like a broken record, but it was mishandled. We were confused. Not only was it something we didn't know about, but we were getting different information. And that made us say, not only do I not believe it, or is this a conspiracy theory, but then we weren't going to get the vaccine. So not only were we dying more, we also weren't getting vaccinated. And I think that is tragic. And so vaccine hesitancy, I understand it. We have to understand that, ask questions. I mean, I do my best, and I did a lot of work during the pandemic to say, no, the vaccine cannot give you COVID. It's not going to change your DNA. It's not going to affect you having a baby. We have to break down those theories. We have to educate people so that they can make then their best informed decision for their families. I understand why people are hesitant. I ask people to try and focus on getting their information from people who are in the health field, who have studied these things, because I know Facebook is awesome for many, but some people were getting their information from people who were not trained to give that information. So I understand why people are hesitant. I also have seen too many of us dying, as the pastor started off the talk with. I don't want us to continue to die. I don't want us to continue to be disabled. The vaccines will save us, and we are still not out of this pandemic, guys. We're still not out of it. So if you have not been vaccinated, I encourage you to get vaccinated. And if anyone would like to talk to me about it, Deacon Goodman knows how to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to talk to people.
Thank you so much. Again, you have provided us a trove of information for us to use today and to share with others. We thank you, and our blessings to you and your beautiful son and family.
Thanks, guys.
So we're going to move on. We're getting to a close here, guys, so hang in there. We're going to bring back our opening speaker, Sister Aziza Todd, who's, after hearing these magnificent presentations, is going to come with some follow-up and some closing thoughts for us to think about, and more importantly, for things for us to do. So welcome back, Aziza.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen one last time. Okay. Let me see. Well, actually, I'll just leave it here. So like I said, there's been an abundance of really great suggestions, and everybody has shared such amazing work that they do, as well as suggestions and feedback. So I personally don't feel like I need to go as in depth with any suggestions or strategies, because I think we are already laying the foundation for the work there. But I do want to just quickly kind of take home some 4 key points. So 1, that racism directly influences the health outcomes of everyone. It's not just, once again, particularly Black and brown folks that are experiencing this, but also just thinking about the strain that it has on all populations and interconnectedness in it all. Once again, think about the quote around racism, right? It saps the energy of all communities. So once again, just acknowledging that it's not just an issue that Black and brown and marginalized folks have to face, but we all need to face as a collective, especially when it comes to increasing positive health outcomes. The next one is that eliminating racism requires an acknowledgement of history, both past and present. I added that real quickly, just given the previous presentation. I think that's so huge, as well as social ideologies. It's important for us to, when we're doing this work, to come with some context and background, both past and present, around how racism shows up in not only our everyday lives, but also our parents' lives and generations behind us. And knowing that there is heavy influence in the policies, the social roles, the ideologies that come at stake when we are working to promote justice and equity. So having that foundation, that background, that knowledge beforehand really supports us in how we can do better and change our strategies to address racism. And I added this quote, or I added this last one, that we have to work as a collective. So many questions I saw in the chat box were asking about, well, if I have, a community member, if I know somebody in my life, or who do I reach out to if I know somebody? That already shows that we're taking the necessary strides to advocate and support for the folks that exist within our own communities. That's why I use the ecological model as a framework, because it acknowledges that we can't continuously view racism as an individual instance. It has to be viewed as a collective, because we can be powerful in numbers. And so in working as a collective to combat racism, we're taking in folks' lived experiences and working to develop new and improved strategies to promote better health outcomes, because we know that we're just stronger in numbers. And then lastly, investing in our communities means divesting from racist institutions. As mentioned, once again, thinking about redlining and how that plays a role in the allocation of particular funds towards specific communities, or thinking about, once again, how I mentioned Oakland and their increase of the police budget, and how that money could actually be used to promote and support community organizations that are doing on the ground work to divest from racist institutions and racist practices. So investing in our community means also getting involved. So for folks that are here and they know of organizations, or they're currently involved in organizations, this is the time to network with the folks that had these presentations, to do more on the ground work, and start really thinking about how we can strategically invest in our communities to alleviate racism at all levels. So like I said, I feel that all of the presentations today really came with some great strategies and means of understanding and truly addressing how racism through a public health lens needs to be addressed and how it is a crisis, how we can do more within our own communities to raise awareness and to be more strategic in how we come together as a collective. So once again, I want to thank Allen Temple, the Health Education Ministry, for putting together such a foundational and instrumental virtual health fair. And for folks that were able to attend today, I hope you all were able to step away with new insight. And also for the presenters here who shared so much knowledge. I have so much to learn from you all. So I want to thank you all for investing your time and your knowledge and your expertise in sharing how we can view racism as a public health crisis and the work that can be done to alleviate that.
Thank you, Aziza. Can we give Aziza and all of our presenters a hand, wherever you are? Just thank you all for sharing this time and space with us. You have been extraordinary in your generosity and your expertise, and we will refer to this seminar, for a while, because you've given us rich information. And again, please stay tuned, because we're getting ready to do the wheel of words in a moment. And I've been corrected that the survey will actually show up after the webinar ends. So stay on and a link will immediately appear for you to provide your feedback. So before our closing prayer by our stalwart Deacon Eddie Walker, on behalf of Allen Temple, our wonderful senior pastor, Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson, the co-chairs of this ministry, Deacon Harold Goodman and Sister Nubia Esmeralda King, we want to thank you for spending this time with us and for your participation. And it doesn't stop here. Please share the links, which will be available hopefully tomorrow, with friends and family. Have conversations with the people that you love, because our health matters and we all have the power to make changes, both in our structures, policies, but also in our individual health and circumstances. So thank you for being with us. And now I'd like to introduce our stalwart deacon, Eddie Walker. He established the Oakland-based Walker Realty Group in July of 2004. A licensed broker in the state of California, Eddie has a 30-year history in retail banking, mortgage lending, and community economic development. Deacon Walker is deeply committed to community activism and volunteerism, and is active with numerous civic and community organizations, including current leadership on the boards of directors of the San Francisco Housing Development Corporation and the Eddie Walker Senior Memorial Scholarship Fund. Eddie holds a master's degree in business administration and a bachelor's degree in management from Golden Gate University in San Francisco. Eddie is a native Oakland, California, and a deacon at Allen Temple Baptist Church, where he serves on many committees and boards, including this ministry, Health Education, and the Allen Temple Housing and Economic Development Corporation. Good afternoon, Deacon Walker. The floor is yours.
Shall we pray? Father God, we thank you for this day. Father God, we thank you for our pastor. Please bring her home safe while she's taking the vacation. Father God, we thank you for our church, our families, and our community. And we thank you for our health education ministry. Father, we thank you for each and every expert who was on our program today, sharing knowledge and information. May we all use this information to save lives and better our community. Father God, we are lost without you. If we do everything in our lives with you first, you will lead us and guide us to a better place. These blessings we ask in Jesus' name. May we all say amen.
Amen. Thank you, Deacon Walker. And now, the final two spins of the wheel of words. Drum roll. Congratulations, Lynetta, one of my balcony buddies. We will get the information from your contact information and get it to you. And now the second and final spin. Joyce Jordan, congratulations. So again, we thank you. And that is the end of the 2022 Virtual Health Fair by the Allen Temple Health Education Ministry. Wait for the close and the webinar link, the survey link to show up on your screen. We thank you all. Please enjoy the rest of your day and continue to be in good health. God bless you all.